ওকে,
আচ্ছা, আমরা যারা বলছি না সবাই তাহলে আমরা মিউট করি নিজেদেরকে।
okay, is Oritra ready?
Yes, ma'am, we are live.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. After having a very insightful and thought-provoking opening day yesterday with the sessions of Professor Guru and Professor Sarukai, I welcome you all once again to the second day of the 3-day international webinar on Theorising Caste, Castes of Theory, organized by the Department of Sociology in collaboration with the IQAC. In the very beginning, I would like to request all once again to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to ensure a smooth functioning of the virtual platform. Now I would like to request Professor Ramanuj Ganguly, Professor, Department of Sociology, WBSU, to give the welcome address. Sir, please. Sir, microphone, I think it's...
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful session, yes, truly yesterday, and we hope that today as well it will be a wonderful day for all of us. So, dear colleagues and friends, welcome you all again to the second day of the international webinar, Theorising Caste, Castes of Theory, being convened by Professor Ritu Sen Chaudhary and Dr. P.P. Chatterjee on behalf of Department of Sociology, West Bengal State University. I'm sure you all will agree that it is extremely heartening to see fresh minds are engaging themselves in 2020 in the arduous task of theorizing caste. We are hosting today 4 extremely bright scholars from beyond our disciplinary boundary, with a tad hand of guidance from a very experienced sociologist, Dr. Prasad. Being a student of sociology since my higher secondary classes, I have encountered caste in my academic discipline more than in my personal life. And the challenges it throws at you on a lighter note are more mesmerizing than what Cristiano Ronaldo or Shane Warne could do on field. Theorizing caste, in my personal experience, places oneself in a quagmire that is extremely contested to trudge. A funny thing about social science is, to my observation, is that every concept and theory are hotly contested. With regard to caste, it exhibits different dynamics, and as Professor Bose alluded yesterday, it is a historically contingent proposition. The various issues that often befriend us as we engage with caste start from our own experience. Say a person from West Bengal like me, in contrast to Maharashtra, would react to caste differently, since the latter come informed with the numerous movements that have colored the social milieu. Similarly, as one proceeds with the subjective experience of the agency, the issue of homogenization of experience and the assumption of mechanical solidarity of the agency opens up an area of contest. Maybe my understanding is incorrect, maybe it's a little less, but still, this is how I look at it after all these years. Moreover, in a caste stratified society, which agency will one will take, since all have their own location and context? Lastly, theorizing on caste today often falls in the trap of the early Brahmanical theories of caste, as one starts to emulate the British or French anthropological conceptualization of caste. We, the students of sociology, trying our best to draw our own disciplinary knowledge to define, conceptualize, theorize caste. I'm sure this evening we will be seeing new ways to understand and theorize in the papers to be presented and from the ensuing discussion. Welcome you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Now, without any further delay, we move on to the main session of the day. Today's session will be chaired by Dr. Srirupa Prasad. Dr. Srirupa Prasad is the Associate Professor, Department of Women's and Gender Studies, University of Missouri, Columbia. She previously taught at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, USA, in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics. Culture and politics of contagion, hygiene, and infectious diseases constitute one of her main research interests. Her first book, Cultural Politics of Hygiene in India, 1890 to 1940, Contagions of Feelings, published in 2015, investigates genealogies of contagion in colonial India and highlights the dynamic and contested passages between contagion as a microbe and contagion as an effect. She is currently working on a new project studying the history and contemporary politics of tuberculosis and care work in India. One of her other research interests are critical feminist pedagogy and teaching. She received a University of Missouri Diversity Faculty Achievement Award in 2014. We have 4 speakers in this session, and I would like to give a short introduction of them. Hardikbrata is an independent researcher and currently a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Media, Communication and Culture, Jadavpur University. He was a faculty at the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University from 2013 to 2019. He was the recipient of the 4th Fellowship under the program Histories of Modernities and Sexualities in the Global South. Right now, he is working on non-Brahmin caste working lives and related visual practices in West Bengal among specific communities. Samrat is the Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English at Sammilani Mahavidyalaya under University of Calcutta. His doctoral work is on ethico-politics of post-colonial resistances, focusing on Naxalbari movement, a radical Maoist insurgent movement in Bengal. His research interests include experimental Bengali literature, gender studies, post-structuralism, memory studies, and post-humanism. His first co-edited volume, Anxieties, Influences and After, Critical Responses to Post-Colonialism and Neocolonialism, was published in 2009. He has guest edited a special issue of the UGC care-listed international journal Songlap on caste in humanities. Kalyan Kumar is the Assistant Professor, Department of English, Presidency University. His research interests include Indian philosophy, continental philosophy, the interactions between conservatism and liberalism, American pragmatist philosophy of John Dewey, philosophy of race, Dalit literature, philosophy of history, and Ambedkar's political philosophy. He has published several research articles in the Economic and Political Weekly, Dewey Studies, the journal Critical Philosophy of Race, published by the Pennsylvania State University Press, Contemporary Voice of Dalit, and many others. He has also guest edited a special issue on Dalit studies of the international journal Songlap. Subro Saha is the Assistant Professor at the Amity Institute of English Studies and Research, Amity University, Kolkata. After completing his MPhil from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, he joined Utrecht University, Netherlands as an international PhD fellow at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry. Working in the areas of materiality, body, and caste, he has delivered in the recent past many plenary talks in universities like University of Zurich, University of Malta, Utrecht University, Presidency University, among others. He has published in internationally renowned journals like Critical Horizons, Journal for Cultural Research, Caste, a Journal of Social Exclusion, Songlap, and many others. One of his papers on caste received honorable mention in 2019 for the prestigious Blue Stone Rising Scholar Award of Bengal University, Boston. He is also a winner of the Young Researchers Grant in Humanities from the Utrecht International Network. Now, we have such bright young scholars, as Dr. Ganguly also mentioned, and I would like to request Dr. Srirupa Prasad to please begin the session as the participants are eagerly waiting to listen to the speakers. Dr. Prasad, it's over to you now. Srirupa, please unmute yourself.
So the way we decided is that Samrat, Hardik, Kalyan, and Subro, they present their papers, and then I have a few short comments, and after which we open up the papers for discussion and question and answer. So how do we go about the papers? Any particular order?
We thought that Hardik will begin, but then it can always be changed. It's not that there is no hard and fast. So
let's begin then. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, the organizers. I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak about something which I'm still trying to learn. I think I'm audible enough, and I'll attempt something which is, I think, already known by the others. I'm doing an act of repetition, maybe in a little different way. So the title of my paper is, and I'll read out from printout: Portable Bodies, Development and Displacement of Dalit Women's Images. In this presentation, through a photographic image of Budni Mejhan, a Santhal woman, and later through a Bengali language fiction by Mahasweta Devi, which is although not specific to Dalit women's lives, I shall attempt to read how the work of representation constitutes a political and cultural imagination, reified and overt, about employing images of women from Adivasi and Dalit communities to constitute a politics based on identities. However, the play of images, as it lays itself out, is not restricted to particular communities only, but as necessary constructs various notions of Dalit women in particular social registers that more than often ends up producing images and narrate stories of a stronger, well-imagined, all within quotes, nation. The selective politics of making present women who otherwise do not have sufficient presence in whatever we can think of as the socio-political in modern India also throws up questions about what representation is, and can we possibly think beyond it. Let me begin by repeating one story and an iconic photograph from the once existing plan period India. We all know of the Nehruvian dream of modern India: planned growth, heavy industries, and so on and so forth. After his own fashion, Nehru had insisted that 15-year-old Budni Mejhan, a casual worker on the site of Panchet Dam in West Bengal, pressed the button at the power station to signal the start of operations in 1959. So just give me a second. I'll present now and try to show the photograph. Sorry, I'm maybe a little bit clumsy here. Is it visible?
Yes.
Thank you. The photographic image, probably the only one, the singular, that survives of Budni Mejhan from those years and now put to various uses, illustrate a range of contrasts. The Prime Minister, flaunting his trophy of development, here the dam, points his finger towards maybe the sluices that will control the flow of water, literally to turn India green and strong. He seems to be focused. On the contrary, Mejhan, a worker at the dam site, seems rather absent and as if she is guided by the Prime Minister's finger to look at the bullseye of development. The conceptual entirety of such monstrous projects of the Nehruvian era might have already always been lost for the Adivasi woman worker. Her misplaced position at the inaugural podium, a sort of indifference that her expression speaks of, as if needs the didactic finger of Nehru. Look what you have done. I'm quoting from Nehru's other kind of speeches, quotes from other speeches when he's inaugurating to see what was his view of things. We all know these things. In 1955, from the site of another dam on the river Krishna, the Prime Minister declared, "When I lay the foundation stone here of this Nagarjuna Sagar, to me it is a sacred ceremony. This is the foundation of the temple of humanity in India, a symbol of new temples that we are building all over India. At the opening of the Bhakra Dam in northwestern India, Nehru was moved to remark, where can be a greater and holier place than this? These temples of modern India were part of a vision of development where large capital-intensive projects represented economic progress. Also, if we look back at the photograph, one can see a part of a vertically placed crane or such heavy industrial equipment behind Nehru and Mejhan. The presence of such industrial equipment and the frontal visual presence of the body of young laboring women will go on to constitute a genre of popular painted images for calendars and cheap prints, blatantly advertising development, agricultural bounty, bound with the signifying presence of the body of the woman. I'll just move on to next slide. So this is the kind of the image I'm referring to here. And we have had experiences of looking at these kinds of images. This has been particularly studied by Patricia Oberoi in particular, and others have studied this phenomenon which flooded cheap calendar prints across 1960s to the 1980s approximately. Coming back to the photograph at hand, that of Nehru and Mejhan, I'm trying to go back to that photograph again. Coming back to the photograph at hand, it is a neat moment of propaganda. The role of images, artworks ranging from painting to sculpture, monuments and films, play an important role in the way propaganda is identified. Modern propaganda, as part of the emerging democratic society, as much more closely linked to the political model of democracy that one might like to imagine. The photographic image is constituted by the presence of a leader of democracy and another woman whose very presence in it quickly as if symbolizes the need for democracy, industrialization, post-colonial progress, mainstreaming, and such other developmental paradigms. The appeal and the power of the image of Nehru and Mejhan is that at the particular moment of being photographed, they are co-constituting each other. A post-colonial democracy seems to be claiming its authority via signposting such bodies, and as if Mejhan's march into the progress of India, however lost it is, can be notionally made possible at the hands of democratically elected high caste ruling elites. Also, established in the photograph is the idea of bodies suited for hard manual labor, and in a way recasting bodies in the new niche light of development, post-colonial development, and the bodies which are already being marked long into the histories of indentured labor. This in ways invokes the colonial practices of photography, and such photographs relied on social differences flowing from caste-based labor. Photographs of the ayah, the sweeper, manual scavengers, and the notch girls, popular in the imagination of the viewer consumer as bodies performing certain womanly work that can be publicly exchanged and looked at without upsetting orthodox caste and gender sensibilities, became subjects of picture postcards commerce at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th. We all know this. I'm coming back, I'm just okay, let the image remain. I'll just turn it off a few minutes later then. Coming back to the fate of Mejhan, I quote from an essay by Chitra Padmanabhan, and this newspaper essay has been quoted by other authors for other kind of arguments also. I quote from an essay by Chitra Padmanabhan, which was published in the Hindu in 2012, that however, I quote, when the inaugural fanfare was over for good or bad, and Budhni returned to her village Karbana, the village elders told her that by garlanding Nehru at the function, she had in fact married him, since the Prime Minister was not a Santhal and she was no longer part of the community. She was told to leave the village. The inflexibility of the community ensured that the excommunication was complete. The youngster was given shelter by a resident of Panchet, Sudhir Datta, from whom it was said she had a daughter born to a destiny of exile like her mother. In 1962, Budhni was fired from her job at DVC and reduced to doing odd jobs. In the 1980s, probably in the year 1984 or 1985, she traveled to Delhi. She met the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, grandson of the Prime Minister she had garlanded, with a request she wanted to be reinstated at DVC. I'll just unshare this now. I'll stop presenting. To speak at the least, and to begin with, two representations of Budhni's image. The image as in the photograph, which was published well, especially in the Statesman, and her image, more in the French meaning encapsulating her persona, brings up in one way the questions about an oppressive caste society touting its modernity, developmental matrix via representations of iconic moments of inauguration, and in the other way brings one frontally to the casting of Dalit women in everyday lives inside patriarchy in general and inside Dalit patriarchy. Budhni's photographic...
Something is wrong, Hardik?
No, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, Hardik. There is no problem from this side.
Yeah, you are audible.
So, Ritudi, is there any specific things you are trying to address? In general, and inside Dalit patriarchy.
No, it's perfect. It is 100%. Something is wrong in this. It's fine. It's fine.
Thank you.
Please continue. Yeah.
Budhni's photographic moment with Nehru also inaugurates her life in ways further taking her to uncharted territories beyond her grasp, at least social grasp. In this way, one is generally faced with the question of representation and specifically about how to work through it. What is at play is the vulnerability at the unique juncture of gender, class, and majorly caste. Before going into this, let me speak about the already known conceptualizations about Dalit patriarchy. I'm quoting from one of Gopal Guru's essays, much read essays, Dalit Women Talk Differently. I quote, "The popularity of Dalit patriarchy is ever increasing in contemporary feminist scholarship. The feminist anti-caste scholarship of Anjali Arondekar, Charu Gupta, Gail Umved, Shaileja Paik, Sharmila Rege, and Anupama Rao have described untouchable womanhood as unfolding within two patriarchies, Brahminical and Dalit." Unquote. Gopal Guru, in his widely read essay, Dalit Women Talk Differently, writes, "In the post-Ambedkar period, I quote, Dalit leaders have always subordinated and at times suppressed an independent political expression of Dalit women. Dalit women rightly question why they are not considered for the top positions in Dalit literary conferences and institutions. This dissent brings three things to the fore. One, it is not only caste and class identity, but also one's gender positioning that decides the validity of an event. Two, Dalit men are reproducing the same mechanisms against their women which their high caste adversaries had used to dominate them. Three, the experience of Dalit women shows that local resistance within Dalits is important. The whole situation compels us to defend the claim that Dalit women talk differently. I unquote. The notions of Dalit patriarchy, as discussed by Gopal Guru, Uma Chakravarti, and V. Gita, have asked for reasons of such a patriarchy coming into place and sought to explain that why Dalit men oppress Dalit women even after facing caste-based oppressions through time. There is an approach much necessary to move forward and relate conceptual notions to lived experience, leading to multiple notions of actions and praxis. I'll mention one critique of Guru by Sharmila Rege, where she points out that even as Guru's argument, this is of a much older debate I'm referring to, that even as Guru's argument about maintaining a difference and the need for the Dalit woman to talk differently is well accepted, Reggae finds that a standpoint privileging knowledge claims on the basis of social on the basis of social location on claims of authenticity may lead to narrow identity politics and might jeopardize epistemological standpoints of Dalit women's organizations. Also, I'd like to flag an intervention by Anirban Das, which closely addresses the problem we are facing, that is, which way to go. I quote from one of his essays that was published in Chonglap, the editors are here in this panel. I quote, "The problem of theorizing on the avowed base of the experiences of women has been articulated in feminist theory for quite some time. Elizabeth Grosz had articulated this as the problem of being feminist and being theory at the same moment. For being feminist points at its involvement with and its situation in the politics of feminism, a bias from which it has to speak. Being theory would involve a commitment to being applicable across the board universally." Grosz, in that particular essay, had talked of deconstructive move of holding on to both ends of the particular and the universal. I quote from Grosz, quoted in Das's essay. "The dilemma facing feminists involves a conflict between the goals of intellectual rigor, avoidance of the conceptual errors of essentialism and universalism, and feminist political struggles that are directed towards the liberation of women as women. But is this really a choice feminists must face? Is it a matter of preference of one goal over the other? Or can the linkages between theory and political practice be understood differently so that the criteria of intellectual evaluation are more politicized and the goals of political struggle are more theoretized?" I unquote. Let me approach this with some caution and limitedness of knowledge. One can describe, as I am already doing, that for the purpose of this presentation, the unfortunate trajectory, I'm unfolding the unfortunate trajectory of Budni Mejhan. In this way, and in a general sense, I'm reducing, as evidently it is, Mejhan's density and untranslatability of her experiences as a Dalit woman, while keeping afloat the necessary signification of her destiny as a Santhal woman who was also, again, I within quotes use the word, inaugurating herself simultaneously with a developing nation. The moves, if any at all, at this juncture will be fraught with difficulties. In trying to look at Budni Mejhan's image, one can look into the question of representation itself. In Sending on Representation, a 1982 lecture by Jacques Derrida, he reviews the scope of representation. Derrida would not accept the structure of representation in a transparent and unproblematic manner. He takes the argument towards contextualizing of the word represent and warns the reader of the general trend of bad philosophy, he uses it within quotes, where the word will be pushed to its extreme. In doing so, the word will scale off all specific connotations, contexts, and use value towards the destination of where the word will be abstract and independent of any contextualized function. This contextualized function is again within quotes. If it happens so, then what will become of the inquiry into the meaning of being, of which we all have a vague idea at the least? It is here that Derrida says that philosophical common usage always tries to stop the philosophic vertigo and instability. The move is at the same time of a nature, whereas as if one knew what representation meant and as if one had only to adjust this knowledge to a present historical situation, to distribute the articles. As in the seminar where Derrida was delivering the opening address, the types of problems of representation in different regions, but belonging to the same space, that of the seminar. He argues against a quick closure of representation as bad, without the rigor of placing the evaluation of the argument in terms of specificities of disciplines and structure. In tracing the being of representation, where he brings in the example of, in an oversimplifying way, the teaching apparatus where acts like seminars and publications attests to the representation of the being. The objective purpose of representation for the subject will be necessary in the process of institutionalizing of knowledge. The act of making present is an act of bringing into presence, and also at the same time, like all rendering, would be an act of repetition with a possibility of return. Apart from the representation, there is also a pre or being before in the present. The rendering available of the human subject allows the work of representation to happen, and such rendering available is what constitutes the subject as subject. If rendering present is taken to mean repetition, which restitutes thanks to a substitute, we come back to the continuum or the semantic coherence between representation as an idea in mind pointing to the thing, for instance, as the objective reality of the idea, as the picture in place of the thing itself, in Cartesian sense, or in the sense of the empiricists, and on the other hand, aesthetic representation, theatrical, poetic, literary or visual, and finally, political representation. The visual representation, as one such act of representation, lays bare the economies of marking bodies as sites of development of the nation, here in this case at least, while keeping intact the namelessness and marginality of women. Since the 19th century, the salvage paradigm of photography by the colonial regime has similarly, but to different uses, classified women in India in ways that clearly highlighted either Brahminical origin of the Maharanis, or pious Hindu women, or caste mark bodies adhered to specific trades such as notch and sex work, through which women of particular types were rendered easily available. It is a well-discussed genre of visual representation in the South Asian scenario, which has continuously produced an economy of women's images and exoticized caste mark bodies as vulnerable, usable, describable, in order that the caste class gender differences can be easily illustrated. The violent illustrative nature of such representations have reinforced differences, while at the surface is the hyperbole of nation development, bringing into the mainstream kind of appeal. Ironically enough, Budhni Mejan was inaugurating a dam which would then in 1959 and at later times through other such developmental projects in post-colonial India destroy Adivasi communities and displace them. In the narrative of the progressing nation, I quote from a source, at another level news source, a constant flow of reports showed up, an all-pervasive sense of the mission. I'm quoting from that point of time in India. India needs 49,000 engineers for the third plan, scientific farming of potatoes, progress in fertilizers, self-sufficiency in steel by 1961, and the progress of the Bhakra operations, among others. Against this spate of cold print, Budhni's fate almost seemed a figment of one's imagination. Her story sank in the media, just like the Santhal villages and historic old temples which got submerged by the waters of the Damodar River impounded by the Panchet Dam. Here I would like to mention that the tribals constituted 56.46% of the population displaced by the Panchet and the Maithon dams, says a 1999 paper on dams displacement policy and laws in India, authored by Harsh Mandar, Ravi Hamadri, and Vijay Nagaraj for the World Commission on Dams. Here at this juncture, we find the image of Budhni at the crossroads of A post-colonial casteist society, B, development of her image as a Santhal woman fronting the development agenda of the nation, C, her ironic position in the event beside Nehru, D, her excommunication from her own community. All these were possible with respect to her caste and gender identity, to which, in proper terms of the social, she had no access from both ends of the high and privileged caste structure of the social. She had no access, privileged caste structure holding up her as a trophy, or from her Adivasi community patriarchal structures, the norms of which she had flouted unknowingly. None of the above can, even at the least, can account for the impossibilities of identities and the traces of an Adivasi Dalit life she had faced and lived up to. The moment of inauguration and the subsequent closures in the life of Budni Mejan in ways make us aware of the difficulties and the necessity to be done, the necessary work to be done ahead. On one hand, I'm just moving into another point about the philosophical area of how can we think about this. On the one hand, Sundar Sarukkai reminds us that boiling down experience only to subjectivity and the private might jeopardize the political task at hand. I quote, "The reason why experiences are therefore in principle not subjective and private is that the concepts are not private and subjective. Consider a person who has a particular experience. Once this person is told that there are experiences that are humiliating, it allows this person to use this concept to describe her own experiences. This means that she might experience the same experience she had been having earlier, but now filtered through this concept of humiliation. This radically changes her perception of experiences as well as her actions. Feminism has shown how powerful these concepts can be to re-describe experiences. Dalit movements have shown how various concepts have been powerfully used for social mobilization and action towards social change." Unquote. On the other hand, the notions of work and labor, here Mejan as performing the work of inauguration and she as a laborer at the dam site, lived and perceived, when reviewed through critical feminist perspectives, have definite inferences and meanings, where usually the realm of the photographic images of women performing different kinds of work can pose a methodological difficulty to account for. The seeming question is, how do you quantify the work done, if at all, in an image? Does it not come to us with the anxieties that representations, especially unquantifiable ones, infects the atmosphere of reception of the represented woman? Have we really looked into women working, performing labor in the everyday, more often than not invisibly, Or have representational strategies naturally subsumed such work and labor into thinking of the category woman within the dominant discourses? Pictorial depictions and photographic images of women working have been often simply used as illustrations, bordering on aestheticization of the laboring body of the woman, reminding one of the toil, grit, and undaunted spirit of woman in specific use contexts. Budni's photographic representation also reminds one of the pretty long histories of indentured labor through its enunciation of a lean young body used to hard labor. I'll just show one photograph. This one, which shows the statesman covering the event and writing about it. Meanwhile, I'm coming back again to the case of the photograph, having discussed some of the theoretical assumptions and bases from which we can read it. The Panchet Dam inauguration had notched a euphoric lead in many newspapers. The Statesman gave Budni top billing along with the dam. DVC's biggest dam in commission, women builder opens sluices, its reporter stated on a breathless note. Mr. Nehru, as she invited Mrs. Budni Majhi, which was written in that way in the newspaper, a young Santhal worker, to switch on the power station here, said it was right that those who had worked on a project should have the honor of declaring it open, unquote. In doing so, again I quote, Mrs. Majhi became the first worker in the country to declare a dam in commission when she switched on the power station, unquote. The same report added that she spoke in Santhali, dedicating the 134 feet high dam to the nation. The image of a 15-year-old tribal girl dedicating a dam to the nation in a tongue not even officially recognized by the nation was somehow ironic. But that detail seemed not to bother the writer. Santhali was included as an official language in the 8th schedule of the Constitution only in 2003. Budni Majen, representing herself and the iconic moment in the new life of the nation, in way turns her multiple acts of representation over the wildly speculative way in producing an ontological eminence of the past as used by La Capra. I'm reading Spivak's use of La Capra here. She uses La Capra's argument against an unthought of passion of archivalism, which she calls an indiscriminate mystique, which is bound up with hegemonic pretensions. The archive as fetish is a literal substitute for the reality of the past, which is always already lost for the historian. When it is fetishized, the archive is more than the repository of traces of the past, which may be used in its inferential reconstruction. It is a stand-in for the past that brings the mystified experience of the past itself, an experience that is always open to question when one deals with writing or other inscriptions. I unquote. The last trace of Budni was found in a 2001 news report uploaded on the website ambedkar.org. Headlined, "Tribal Wife of Nehru is Outcast, Driven to Poverty," it recounted these details of Budni's life. Stating that the 58-year-old was working at DVC, the report quoted Budni as saying, "I wish they would allow me to go back to Karbana, the village from where she was long excommunicated, long back." Padmanabhan in the Hindu states that Budni Majan made very thin headlines when she passed away a few years back. The historical material-based archive, the photograph and the narratives flowing from it, in the sight of my praxis in this presentation as we get it, will in ways perpetually fail to account for it. One can, in a Derridian way of reading, problematize the concept of the archive, but cannot essentially do away with the notion of it. The archive, with its irreplaceable singularity of the document, which it aims to interpret each time in its original uniqueness, should be available idiomatically, at once offered and unavailable for translation. He interprets and exposes the work of the archive as permitted with a political and ethical function that can only possibly happen if the historian, the user, and the archivist will think of the incompleteness of the materiality of the object of representation in an epistemological framework. Budni Majan remains the impossible figure of the South Asian Dalit woman, slashed across by caste and gender into abjection. Spivak, although not specifically about Dalit women, writes, "Between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, the figure of the woman disappears, not into pristine nothingness, but into a violent shuttling that is the displaced figuration of the third world woman caught between tradition and modernization, culturalism and development. To move forward with the figure of Budni Majan is difficult. Looking at her in the photographic representation and in the archive she produced, however misplaced it is a seeming impossibility." Sorry, I'll just stop sharing. How to account for her excommunication, producing another complex notion of untouchability. How to account for her being fired from her job, and she at a later date appealing to Rajiv Gandhi for a reinstallation at the dam site. Are such experiences reducible to data? These remain just two of the number of questions, silences, and pauses around her representation where methodologies might fall short in accounting for the complexities of violences and irresponsibilities she experienced and carried in her. Further from this, I am reminded of Mahashweta Devi's longish story, The Pterodactyl, Puran Sahai, and Pirtha, where Poshupati, where I'm quoting from the story, and this is also about the questions, the famine and the development paradigm that developed in India, where I quote, "Poshupati Jonko of the Ho tribe of Singhbhum, a native Ho speaker, had said with humble amazement at the time of translating Birsa Munda's life into the Ho language that there are no words for exploitation or deprivation in the Ho language. There was an explosion in Puran's head that day." I unquote. To quote Devi in conversation with Spivak, I'm quoting from the interview. So Pterodactyl wants to show what has been done to the entire tribal world of India. We did not know it. It was like a continent. We did not try to know it. It is the same everywhere. I think of the two American continents. If 1,000 Indian tribals, men, women, and children sit, how quiet they are, how quietly they listen to the people. They shove and nudge, they hum and sing, and they whisper, "It is not in us." I unquote. Insofar, the pterodactyl is an uncontainable spectre, a sense of sublime tear through the novella which eludes us, which the us is the metropolitan readers in Spivak's expression, the pragmatic solutions offered by a post-colonial nation on a mapped tribal terrain in central India, only to the effect that it fails. However, Devi's account is not without responsibility and hope. Spivak, in a translator's preface, writes, "In the secret singularity, the object of ethical action is not an object of benevolence, for here responses flow from both sides. It is not identical to the frank and open exchange between radicals and the oppressed in times of crisis, or the intimacy that anthropologists often claim with their informant groups. This encounter can happen when the respondents inhabit something like normality. This is why ethics is the experience of the impossible." Please note that I'm saying that ethics are impossible, but I'm saying, but rather that ethics is the experience of the impossible. This understanding only sharpens the sense of the crucial and continuing need for collective political struggle, for a collective struggle supplemented by the impossibility of full ethical engagement, not in the rationalist sense of doing the right thing, but in this more familiar sense, the impossibility of love in the one-on-one way for each human being. The future is always round the corner. There is no victory, but victories that are also warnings. Unquote. The questions that follow then are how to see and make that communication. The problem that arises as one reads through Devi's text, as Spivak points out, is, are we not placing that aboriginal in aboriginality without epistemological care? The conflation of land and nation that produce the social in turn spectralizes Partha and the famine, only to represent and reproduce it through relief material and data. The government officials come during the rainy season to survey the situation. They see plenty of water in the river, therefore concludes that it cannot be a drought. The Partha famine, as Spivak argues, cannot be constituted as evidence according to statistical manipulation of the post-colonial state. In ways, Partha, the piece of land where there is the cave, the paintings and dikhia, and the bird and the journalist Puran Saha, changes shape with the narrative as they struggle to contain each other or represent enough, the constant search for the image that might fit the representation, the description. The image as map, the image of the shadowy form of the bird, the image of the survey map, the image as the geological times that put under erasure the post-colonial survey, the image as pterodactyl's eyes, Bikhia's eyes. Budni, on the other hand, had a brush with the developmental politics, reproduced herself through it, and dwindled into faint trace left in a few journalistic endeavors through the long decades of the Indian post-colonial. The singularity of Budni Majen remains irreducible as with the famine-stricken land of Partha. Beside the differentiated material truth and the historical truth, there is the presence of the truth of delusion emerging from the work of psychoanalysis as of hauntedness, hallucination, and delusion. The presence is always repressed, but according to Derrida, it returns as the spectral truth, which is part of the truth, irreducible by elucidation. I'll just show you one last photograph. I just happened to come across these photographs in the last few days, but it's also an interesting end to the kind of narration that I'm trying to make here, at least I'm attempting to make here. However, last year in 2019, there was a discovery by Sarah Joseph, a novelist from south of India, who was writing a novel about Budni's experiences, that contrary to what was reported earlier, if you remember in Padmanabhan's report, which is oft quoted by many sources, that she had died already before 2012. Majen was still living. Joseph traces her back to her village where she lives, and there was another surge of news about Majan, mostly in the web world, which died down as quickly as it began. Budhi Majan's life, her passing away, and then being salvaged as not being dead and still living, perhaps represents the impossibility of Dalit lives as they viciously encountered the caste society in India. Through the remembering, forgetting, and being aware that she still lives, one has only represented her and cannot go further from here. One pauses, but at the same time, one can only become responsible to her life, her usages, and violations in the language of modernity, caste, and development. Her representative image, more in the sense of the French word image, infects the archive in ways known and unknown, with everything that she could not utter through the archive, where she is still being written now as a novel. Thank you.
After this, maybe Kolyan can go ahead with his presentation.
Srirupa, I was actually expecting Samrat to be the next speaker, but I can go ahead if you so want.
Okay, no, I really, you know.
But I think Samrat is sort of too eager to speak.
Yes, Samrat, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Samrat, you have to unmute.
Yeah, Kolyan can go ahead as well. I don't have any problem. You are not audible.
Srirupa, you have to unmute your yeah.
Samrat, why don't you go ahead? You know.
Okay, fine. Then. Thank you. So, the title of my paper is The Spatial Politics of Abandonment, Dalit as the Death-Bound Subject. So, first, let me apologize because this paper is something a bit different from what I have sent to Srirupa before and what she has read, because this is the reading of a new story. One thing is, I begin with the question, is there something called Dalit in West Bengal? And it is also related to the generality of the question that is there something called Dalit? What is Dalit? What constitutes Dalit as such? And I will be speaking on the negotiation and connection between experience, memory, and writing, without assuming them to be transparent and pre-given. So, experience as we have already been hearing for some time, is a paradigm which has been overtly discussed in the context of Dalit studies as of now. But I think the question of experience should be connected with memory, which actually Raghuramanu proposes when he is making a critique of the first book by Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukkai. And he talks about the importance of memory in the formation of perception, because without memory, no perception can be developed. So I'm trying to relate these two with a third possible paradigm, which has been overtly discussed in literary theory. I'm not so sure how much in sociology, but literary theory, we discuss the concept of writing and representation. And representation in the form of writing. So I will be speaking about these related concepts, and what I will be doing is to ask also whether it is possible to write the Dalit experience, or if Dalit experience constitutes the identity of the Dalit, then what it means to be what it means to have the Dalit experience in the form of writing. Writing, of course, it doesn't mean literally writing, but also representing, enacting, performing the Dalit experience to the others, to the rest of the world. And if we assume that uh, the Dalit identity is something, the two aspects of Dalit identity. On one hand, Dalit identity is something which is not pre-given. It is a political act of producing a Dalit identity against the Brahminical uh, caste structure, instead of just referring them to be lower caste or the governmental categories of SC, ST, OBC, whatever. Uh, the outcast groups, instead of marking them with governmental names or descriptive sociological, anthropological names, the concept of Dalit is itself produced through an act of writing, the act of representing, and through a creation of a collective memory, an archive of memory in the form of writing, which produces the Dalit as a category. So, and it is interesting to note that in the I will begin with the recent context, very recent context, the debate which is going on in West Bengal, that if there is anything called Dalit in West Bengal. This question has been raised. I am saying raised because this question has been raised again and again in various contexts previously as well, and in other forms also, when it has been said that we don't have casteism in West Bengal, and this has been adequately answered historically and sociologically and politically by scholars such as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay or Dwaipayan Sen, who talked about the repressed histories of the repressed history and the historical negation of the Namushudra caste in particular in the context of Dalit migration. But what I am trying to frame here is to like compose and formulate a Dalit identity based on the notion of writing, and I will be referring primarily to two texts, two short stories, focusing on one of them more. The name of the short stories are in Bangla. Both stories are by Jotin Bala, Namushudra migrant writer. He has been a East Bengali refugee, and he has also written two volumes of autobiography or memoir, we can put it like that. One is like Shikar Chera Jibon, one of the titles of his autobiography, Rootless Life, and the other is Jibon Juddher Damama. Jibon Juddher Damama can be translated as the drums of the war of life. So, and the stories which I will be mentioning, I'm saying that the names of the stories. One is Edo Bhagar. Edo Bhagar. This is from a collection called Dalit Manusher Golpo. Is the stories of Dalit lives, edited by Jotin Bala himself. The story is called Edo Bhagar, which in English can be translated as murky or dingy dump yard. It is basically the story of it is about a kind of animal dump yard, which is referred to the story, which I will come back soon. And the other story, which I will be referring, it is published in a Bengali journal called Gangchil. It is called Bastu Bhumi, which simply means homeland. It can be simply translated, though Bastu has a much more complex connotation in Bangla. Yet I will translate it easily as the homeland. So Bastu Bhumi or homeland. These two stories I will be discussing. As I was referring to the debate which is going on for the last few days in Bengal, in West Bengal, after there was this kind of like announcement of the establishment of a Bengali Dalit Literary Academy, Bengali Dalit Sahitya Academy, by the government of West Bengal, and with the presidency of the celebrated Dalit writer Manoranjan Bapari. Some people started asking whether we do have a Dalit in Bengal, because Dalit is a term which is more connected with literatures from Maharashtra, Kerala, and other places of India, and we have not heard of it. And if there, and the question was not that whether there is a Dalit literature. The question was that whether there is something called Dalit. And I have started my argument and my presentation with that. And immediately after that, when people started asking this, there was a proliferation of experiences. People started writing their experiences, that if there is no Dalit, who are we? And the same question becomes the title of an article in today's newspaper, HOM. If there is no Dalit in West Bengal, then who are we? Who are we? And they are repeatedly talking about their experience of marginalization in their lives in various ways. And it cuts across. It comes from villages, it comes from cities, it comes from various classes also, various educational background. And instead of arguing what is a Dalit, if there is a Dalit literature, giving archival resources, giving scholarly books, there is a proliferation in a particular Facebook post, 18, 19, and it grew in number over time. So the writing of Dalit experience can be thought of as constituting the Dalit identity. The Dalit subjectivity and experience, they are co-constitutive. One is not before the other. So let us put it in this way. Another thing is, if we come to the sphere of Dalit writing and Dalit literature, I was talking about the historical positioning of Dalit, and when Doipan Sen talks about Dalit in West Bengal in his book, he wrote it with a kind of apology that maybe I am sounding anachronistic, because the term Dalit has come much later than the actual Dalit politics has begun. And there has been a historical and political silencing of the Dalit voices, as he was writing in his book. So one way is to politically do that. One way is, I am again recalling, one way is to do it historically, as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay has done. There can be other anthropological, sociological ways also. But one way is in terms of writing, in terms of what they have produced. And I will be talking about the specificity of writing, the politics of writing, what kind of writing constitutes the Dalit experience. Is this writing the same as any other kind of writing? Or the writing of Dalit experience has any kind of specificity which is connected with their particularity of their experience? This is the question which I am trying to raise. Now, if we go back to the book by the first book I am referring primarily, The Cracked Mirror by Sundar Sarukkai and Gopal Guru, we will see that Gopal Guru was talking about, as we have already heard in the last day's discussion, it has been variously discussed, the difference between, in the first essay of the volume, I'm again referring, egalitarianism and social sciences in India, the name of the essay. Here he was talking about the difference between theoretical Brahminism and empirical, Shudra identity. This is the people who are doing empirics of caste. They primarily come from a lower caste background, though he's using the term Shudra, which is problematic. And on the other hand, there is the theoretical Brahmin who are doing much more purer, much more universal thing. But when he's going into this argument, at one point he was referring to a very, very interesting thing. That is, he was talking about Maratha folk song, where he was talking about the contribution of different castes, the Brahmins what they do, uh, the the Brahmins, they primarily, from them primarily we read and learn, uh, and they teach us. And then we have cultivators who till the land, who thrash the crops. And then we have the Mahars. And what do the Mahars do? They sing. It's a beautiful folk song that he refers. They sing, and immediately afterwards, he was talking about that how primarily the Dalit
Uh,
scholars is.
Sorry, Shamrat, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, can you please speak into the microphone? It's sometimes you are inaudible and it's difficult while they are live streaming it on YouTube.
Oh,
So
okay,
can you
okay.
speak into the mic? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll do that. So, uh, what I was trying to say is that the Dalit experience uh, is something uh, uh, that, as I was trying to posit, uh, is in the it is, can we call it simply an empirical data, or when it comes in the form of writing, it goes beyond the empiricism, the empirical data, and particularly the creative aspect of it. And one very important intervention by a Raghuram when he makes a criticism of the cracked mirror, he says, I'll just quote, MSS Pandian, in a recent response to Guru's essay under discussion, says that social science theory often fails to produce morally and politically enabling knowledge of and for Dalits and other subaltern groups because of its own ground rules. He goes on to argue about how theory does not enable one to talk of one's distress and the bitterness of others. This is due to the fact that while social science practices and theory making belong to the discourse of causality, the Dalit texts such as Karukku and Vadu belong to the discourse of participation. And what I'm trying to interrogate is what kind of participation we are talking about here. What do you mean by participation? And this participation happens through the writing of collective memories, the writing of memorizing, like remembering the experiences and writing them and forming a collective. That is the crux of Dalit identity. And in this case, what kind of experiences we will talk about? One very important term which Professor Guru has used in his book is the archaeology of untouchability. And archaeology of untouchability is something which goes beyond spatial rule, spatiality. It moves across time and space. The archaeology or the arche, the arc which governs the state of belonging, goes beyond the time and space and attains a certain kind of universality. So the archaeology of untouchability is such that it flows from it cuts across the village community to the modern urban secular spaces, and it cuts across the pre-modern to the modern and postmodern times, if we have anything like that at all. And what constitutes that? And I will say one of the two related things is the spatial, what constitutes this archaeology of untouchability, borrowing from another important thinker, Abdul Jan Muhammad, who writes a book called Death-Bound Subject, from whom I have borrowed the title of my paper, Dalit as the Death-Bound Subject, that death is one of the experiences, that not death, but the possibility of death, the immanent possibility of death, the paradigm of death, which constitutes the subjectivity of the Dalit. And as we all know that death has to be kept separated, segregated, and removed from life. Dead in very death and dead both, because the dead is reminiscent of death, and man wants to distance death. And when in the discourse of death, which we encounter in philosophy, in phenomenology, we see that death is often thought of not only as inscrutable, but as something which is absolute, and it is always distanced from the human subject. So there is a surety of death, but there is also a distancing of the death. And what I'm trying to posit is that this distancing of the death, distancing with the death, is actually collapses in case of a Dalit identity. I'm not talking about a Dalit individual in particular, but if you historically and grammatologically study a Dalit identity, Dalit writing in particular, then you will see that this distancing collapses, and the paradigm of life, of the life affirming citizenship or subjecthood, is something which is totally unavailable for the Dalit subject, or the Dalit, or the life affirming biopolitical apparatus in both the pre-modern and the modern times, across times, is constituted by the abandonment of the Dalit. And if we remember Ambedkar's work on this, just two short mentions. I don't have time to elaborate on that. One is the text by, which is the famous text, the untouchables, who they are and how they became untouchables, and another very short essay, Out of the Fold, where Ambedkar was talking about the concept of a fold, the village as a fold, as a complete segregated entity, which is a protected state of being from which the Dalits are abandoned. Or in the essay on, in the long essay, book length essay on untouchables, who they are and how they become untouchables, Ambedkar was using his anthropological imagination. He was using his anthropological imagination to talk about the Dalits as broken men. Then once upon a time, there used to be this war between the tribes, when all the tribes were nomadic, and they started settling down, and the tribes who were massacred and destroyed and defeated, some of the members who were alive were not allowed to stay in the peripheries of the village, because they were the outsiders, they were the other. So but they were needed. I will tell you how they were needed. They were needed to protect the village. So there was a contract. There was a contract between the villagers with these broken men, that they will remain outside. They will be fed by the villagers, but they cannot come. Their entry into the village is conditional, and they will protect the village from the attack of the outside. So they became the bare life, the bodies, expendable bodies, who cannot be given protection, who are who are just given bare minimum survival, but always remains in the immanent shadow of the death. So with this, and this is what I call therefore their subjectivity I call is death-bound subject. And this death is not, it doesn't talk about the physical death. Physical death is always an example which creates the concept of death-bound subject, but it is not simply physical death, but it is the possibility of death, the immanent possibility of death, which constitutes also what I'm borrowing this term again from Abdul Jan Muhammad. He talks in the context of Afro-Americans, he uses this term, an archaeology of death. So an archaeology of, we can ask this question, I'm not giving an answer, we can ask this question, whether the archaeology of untouchability is also an archaeology of death, and what kind of archaeology of death it is. I'm not conflating it with the Afro-American context, of course, but one thing is we know that there have been several theories of abandonment in Foucault, in Agamben, in the recent theoretical explorations, and in case of Butler as well, where in order to protect the citizens, the proper citizens, the subjects of biogovernance, huh, we need to create a outside, which need to create, which at the same time guarantees the freedom and survival of the inside, but it also uh, becomes exemplary of what can happen if one is abandoned. So the secured self is only created by through this process of abandonment. And if we again quickly go back to Ambedkar, Ambedkar delineates the meaning of the word ontojo, which is often it denotes the untouchables in Indian language, which means uh, born in the end. And Ambedkar argues that the born in the end means born in the fag end of the village. So in the outside of the village, in the fringe of the village. So I am trying to delineate Dalit as a border concept. And this can again be related, which I will not be doing here. It can again be related to the concept of touching and non-touching. And very beautifully, Guru and Sarukai in their book, they have described two kinds of untouchables. The pure untouchables, that is the upper caste, and the outcast, who are the despicable untouchables. He uses untouchables for both these groups. This is very very interesting. That so untouchability becomes a border concept which separates the two kinds of people, the subjects of life and governance and the subjects of death. So now I quickly, without doing much, I will just move on to the two stories and talk about the two kinds of death-bound subject. The first story which I referred, the story titled Edo Bhagar, or dingy dump yard. It tells the story of a man who who in search of food, a Dalit man who in search of food moves from his place to place and requests people to give him food. He is a chamar by profession, and he works with but he is right. The story is set in a time when the practice of skinning animals was gradually shrinking, and he was out of his job, out of his profession. So this is a very very interesting point. And this man, he moves to the dump, near the dump yard, and we see parallelly a cow has died. A cow has died in mysterious circumstances, and nobody knows that how it has died, and people are suspecting that it has been poisoned. So, and they think that in order to skin an animal and have the leather, perhaps a chamar has committed this hideous crime, a crime for them. So when this person reaches the dump yard, he is beaten black and blue. He is almost beaten to death, and his eyes are taken out. And these people say that dump yard is only a proper place for the Dalits, not Dalits, but this kind of people, this lower caste, this Achut, this lower caste people. The proper place is the dump yard. Now, this is a story which is set in a village, and only after his eyes are taken out, eyes are gouged out, that this person, Horihar, he realizes that the kind of discrimination, the actual discrimination, actual casteism, where they don't have any place in this world. So this sense of unbelonging and sense of being living dead haunts the story. And this is one kind of death-bound realization of a death-bound subject, where the subject is realized to be within the paradigm of death by through violence, through direct violence and direct attack. And the second kind of death-bound subject is where I will be describing in the second story, the homeland, Bastu Bhumi, where we see that the the Dalit subject is there into disaster. I was reading this book, The Writing of a Disaster. It's a very, very interesting book by Maurice Blasho. And there, Blasho was talking about the relationship between disaster and silence, and that unspeakability of disaster. So he uses the term describe in by breaking it, describe, describe. So it's a process of unwriting also. Writing about disaster is also about unwriting the experience of the disaster. And what he says is that what characterizes disaster is the difference of the subject of disaster from death collapses, and death doesn't remain absolute and concrete to the subject of disaster. So for the subject of disaster, death on one hand becomes an immanent possibility. On the other hand, death becomes much more inscrutable, and much more complex because the subject is already there in unfathomable. It is as the subject belongs to the paradigm of death. So he cannot keep out death as it happens in case of the man's relationship with death. So he has to speak in a language which inscribes death, but at the same time, death cannot be spoken. If you think about the relationship between language and death, the death cannot have any language because it is beyond the paradigm of experience. Nobody has experienced death. So moving to the next story, I just quickly summarize. The plot is very simple. It is not at all complex. The thing is that there is a man called Gopal. He's a disenfranchised man. He's Bengali refugee, homeless, and he sleeps beneath trees and takes shelter in temporary shades. On one night of heavy rainfall, and you see that how disaster, the concept of disaster, is not separated from the ideological and spatial arrangement of the sphere of life. Disaster is ingrained within the political economy of space as such. So disaster is not only natural disaster which is given from outside, and there is a place where it is said that disaster, the Dalits, the lower caste people, the migrants, the refugees, they always pray to God that, oh God, there should not be any rainfall at all. They do not want any rainfall. Rainfall means a kind of precarity, a kind of exposure to the threat of disaster. And this person has experienced multiple disasters. His parents, his entire family has been killed in a riot in the East Pakistan, and this person now is looking for a home. And he reaches a slum. He met a man called, a man who is a kind of, called Aghor Gharami, and the word Gharami means one who builds houses, and it is an ironic, I think it is an ironic reference, Aghor Gharami, and he is looking for this person who stays in a slum. And when he reaches the slum is in utterly destitute condition. The slum is in a very, very wretched condition. I just complete in 2-3 minutes maybe. I hope I am not taking too much of time. If so, just intervene and stop me. So he reaches this Dalit this slum where mainly the lower caste people live, and there he cannot find Aghor Gharami, but meets his young daughter, whose name is Shushila, and the house was almost falling apart. There was rainfall from every side, and along with Shushila there was the grandmother of Shushila, who was dying, who was almost breathing her last, and she was shivering in cold. And then these people, they were looking for a shelter. They came out of that slum because most of the houses were destituted, and this particular house is something which was collapsing. So they comes out. This is not a house; it's a small slum, a shelter maybe. And they come out and they move and finally, they get a shelter under a shade in an open space. There were 3 shades, consecutive shades, and in one of the shades they take shelter. And then gradually they realize that it is a burning heart. It is a funeral space of Hindus. It's a burning heart. And there was rainfall all around. There was sound of thunder all around. And these 2 people, along with the old woman, takes shelter there. And the old woman, the grandmother, passes away. And the story ends with these 2 people making love and coming together. So now, what I was trying to say, and so there was it is not, though I am talking about the death-bound subject, the story does not end in hopelessness. The story as if ends with a kind of entry into the trajectory of life amidst death. So it's kind of passage or a non-passage of death through which these 2 people have to pass, and they can only get the place, their only place is the non-space of the marker of death, that is the burning heart. And as I was reading the book by Agamben, Language, Death and Negativity, where he is talking about the relationship of language and death, and how and he's giving the reference of Oedipus at Colonus, where Oedipus talks about. I'll just read the quote before concluding. The last quote, perhaps. At the end of Oedipus at Colonus, when the now serene hero, and remember that Oedipus was also abandoned, he was considered impure because of his crime. When the now serene hero reaches the hour of death, he begs Theseus, who has accompanied him in those final instants, that no mortal should utter a voice at his tomb. So there should be silence, there should not be any voice. If Theseus will respect this vow, he will have a country forever without pain. By breaking the link between language and death, Oedipus, the last man of pain, puts an end to the chain of tragic guilt that is intermittently transmitted in the nexus between the 2 Moiras of man. So pain which cannot be expressed, and the final reference to tomb, there is a description in the essay where the tomb is compared with the non-space of Khora. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but there is a famous essay.
Samrat, I think Shripadi wants to say something.
Yeah, please.
Samrat, would you be able to wrap up in another minute?
Yeah, sure, please. So the non-place of the Khora, the Khora is a kind of a marker. It is an unmarked place from which everything is born, as described in Plato's Timaeus, and it is associated with a kind of feminine principle in Derrida's essay, but I'm not going into that. So the choric space, I am describing this particular burning heart as a choric space of where one realizes, along with that essay by Agamben on Oedipus, that it is better not to be born at all. So it becomes a place of unborning, unbirth. So unborning, the experience of unborning, it was what constitutes Dalit writing. It constitutes the archaeology of silence and archaeology of death, which is again related to Dalit subjectivity. And through the writing of this impossible experience, that the Dalit subjectivity comes into being. Thank
you. Next, Kalyan will be presenting his paper.
Thank you, Srirupa, and thank you, Rituji, for inviting me to speak here. Am I audible? Is it loud and clear? Okay, great.
Yes, you are.
And thank you, Titi, for introducing me. I'm going to begin with some simple, apparently simple, one might even think of them as banal, and yet I think extremely, uh, you know, loaded questions. Let me just quickly sort of utter these questions. And these are questions that will sort of construct the basis of what I'm going to discuss. But before that, my apologies to Srirupa, because this is not a talk that is entirely based on the paper that I sent to her. I did something that Samrat has also done. So I departed from that paper and only used the last part of that paper published in DV Studies in order to discuss my present concerns this evening. So, yes.
Kolyan, you have to speak into the
Yeah.
mic.
Okay. I will. So, right. Now, the 2 or 3 questions with which I begin are: A, how does Hindutva political ideology mobilize Dalits in their ideological favor as well as electoral favors? How do they convince them to vote for the political right-wing parties like the BJP and the Shiv Sena, for instance? When in their social lives, in their socio-religious lives, in their cultural lives, Dalits are constantly at the receiving end of violence, discrimination by the caste Hindus. How is it that they are mobilized in that sort of in the favor of that Hindutva ideology? That is one question that sort of confuses me a lot, and I think many of us. And the second question, which is related to the third one, are again very simple questions, but at the same time loaded, I believe. Is caste something that is to be understood primarily in terms of the social? And the third one, which is related to the second one, is caste to be understood in terms of something that is related to the political? In other words, the easy answer to it is that both. But it's not so simple, as I will continue to argue after giving you some empirical details and some references. Now, the first textual reference that I make is to a Dalit autobiography by someone called Bhanuvar Meghvansi. Bhanuvar Meghvansi used to be in the RSS, and then so initially he was quite obsessed with the idea of the Hindu Rashtra. He was quite certain about his position, his potential sort of contribution in that RSS project. He was in the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. He was a pracharak in the Sangh. And in course of time, he encountered some experiences of untouchability, experiences of exclusion. Despite his commitments to the RSS and its ideologies, he was constantly feeling alienated. And after a point of time, there are certain episodes in his life that eventually led him to be completely disillusioned with the RSS, so much so that he gave up on the idea of being a Dalit and being a Hindu at the same time. And eventually he gave up his membership from the RSS and decided to work against the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh throughout his life ever since, right? So this is a story, it's a kind of linear kind of narrative that you apparently come across if you read his autobiography, originally written in Hindi, I believe, and then translated in English. So I'm referring to the English translation done by Professor Nivedita Menon and recently published by probably early this year or later last year, in the last part of 2019, I guess. It was published by Navayana. The title of the book is I Could Not Be Hindu, Life of a Dalit in the RSS. That's the subtitle. Now, if you go through this narrative, what struck me is in the initial pages, almost 100 odd pages or so in the book, is the way he's not so much obsessed with the socio-religious idea of being a Hindu, and he is rather quite preoccupied with the political Hindutva identity. Now, this distinction is somewhat cliched by the common sense understanding of these two related terms, at times conjoined terms, at times interchangeable terms. But we know the Shashi Tharoor type of argument that the Hinduism as such, if we can think of it as a socio-religious orientation and that kind of thing, then it's a pluralist one, and you can't really have a solid sort of institutionalized idea of Hinduism in the way one can think of the Abrahamic religious dispensation. So that's a kind of argument that's already available to all of us, and I guess I'm not really talking about that. I'll come to this point again and again at a later stage, almost in the sort of fag end of my presentation today. But if you look at the first 100 pages of the autobiography by Meghwanshi, it is quite clear that in his social life, we have other references to his own personal life, his life in his own family, in his own neighborhood, in the village, etc., in Rajasthan. This is near the Bhilwara region in Rajasthan. So Meghwanshi describes those episodes in his social life, in his religious life, in his life in his own family, in his own village, where he is constantly coming across experiences of untouchability, experiences of social exclusion, discrimination, and so on and so forth. And yet he is at the same time completely, passionately preoccupied with the political project of Hindutva. Now, this seems to be a confusing sort of scenario for all of us, at least apparently. And this is not something that troubles him. That is all the more striking. So what is it? I was trying to read those first 150 pages of the book again and again in order to understand why is it in this phase of his life when he was not really disillusioned with the RSS, and when he was not directly coming across experiences of untouchability and social exclusion within the institutionalized space of the RSS branch in Bhilwara. Why was it that he was so occupied with this idea of Hindutva? And one of the things that really stood out in some sense in those pages of the book is his obsession with the possibility of his contribution to the grand, almost epic, very glamorous, attractive project of almost an enchanting sort of project of a Hindu Rashtra. Building the Hindu Rashtra as a political project is something that keeps him going within the RSS with so much of passion, with so much of enthusiasm and gusto, right? So that is something that's really stood out. Now, as we go ahead and come across those episodes of untouchability within the RSS that he came across, there's a part in the book where he's describing how his family had organized prepared some food when they were about to begin a journey for a grand meeting, perhaps before the Babri Masjid incident. And he is somebody also, let me tell you, he is somebody who actually got imprisoned. He was incarcerated quite a number of times because of his participation in the Babri Masjid incident. He was one of those Karsevaks who actually felt the passion for building the Hindu Rashtra to go and attempt to put an end to that structure, that Islamic structure, architecture, etc. So this man encountered that episode of experience, and there are also similar experiences that he encounters, and he sees that the upper caste members in the RSS did not take that food that his mother, his family members had prepared for his comrades in the RSS. And he feels disheartened, and that's the beginning of his disillusionment with the RSS, and it then goes deeper and deeper, and eventually he is completely disillusioned with the RSS. That is how the story unfolds in his autobiographical narrative. And like most autobiographical narratives, it's a retrospective sort of thinking. So there are passages when he's trying his best to distance himself from the RSS ideologies, even when he's describing those episodes in his life when he was obsessed with the RSS Hindu Rashtra project. So there are references like, oh, I was not like the rest of them. I was very curious, I was argumentative, I was being logical, and I could see that these people were making illogical statements and so on and so forth. So at the end of the narrative, we come across an Ambedkarite, Marxist kind of a figure who is engaged in all kinds of, anti-caste activisms. He's associated with several social activists, mostly with the left, to use that common sense sort of phrase, left liberal lobbies, if you like. And then that is how his life description comes to an end. He's quite active even now, but that is how the story sort of comes to an end in this particular text. And in the last part, again, there was another striking feature that I want to draw your attention to, and that is how he was constantly being offered by the local BJP and the other political organizations and wings of the RSS and Hindutva lobbies. He was constantly offered political positions, so an MLA seat or an MP seat and so on and so forth. These were the offers that were made to him. And he says that there were, points of time when he actually felt tempted to accept them, but eventually he did not. His good sense prevailed. His Ambedkarite self sort of prevented him from accepting these offers, and he dedicated his life for anti-caste activism. He dedicated his life for anti-Hindutva activism, and that is how the story ends. But he also informs us in this last part that many of his comrades, anti-caste, anti-RSS, anti-Hindutva comrades, actually subscribed to these ideologies, not so much because they did not encounter caste-based discrimination within the RSS and outside the RSS in their social lives, in their neighborhoods, villages, but because there were political privileges that they could aspire to, that they could realize in their lives. Now, one of the things, so this takes us back to the first question with which I began. The first question was, how is it that the RSS and the BJP or the political right wing in general in this country, persuade Dalits and other lower caste constituencies in order to not just vote for them, but also at least to believe in their ideologies, to take part in those activities that are born out of those ideologies. Like the Babri Masjid incident, for instance. So that is the question to which I get back to. And then to which I get back. And this question is, as I said, it's very puzzling. Now, social scientists have done some research on caste and Hindutva, if you think of that as a rubric here. And I'll briefly refer to some of these instances. One is the reference to Satish Deshpande's work on caste and Hindutva, where Deshpande is talking about Tor and Jod kind of politics, fission and fusion kind of politics. That is to say that it is a very predicative negotiation as far as the electoral politics of this is concerned. It's a very predicative negotiation at the ground level, at the block level, at the panchayat level, and so on. And that is how intra-caste differences, inter-caste differences are exploited by the BJP in order to, persuade these people, Dalits and other lower castes, especially the OBCs, in their own favor, and also by indoctrinating these people from an early sort of adolescent age or even from childhood by certain, schools and some other social organizations like clubs, etc. Now, this Tor and Jod politics is something that is suffering, in my opinion, from a top-down approach. It is as if the Hindutva brigade comes in and tries to, mostly dominated by the upper caste Hindus presumably, and then persuades the Dalits to work in their favor without, it doesn't take into account the agency of the Dalits as such. What is more interesting for me is, why is it, I'm altering the question with which I began my presentation, why is it that the Dalits feel so passionate about these causes, Hindutva causes, right? What is their agency in it? And now, and how do they become the stakeholders in sort of this kind of Hindutva RSS Hindu Rashtra project? That is the question that interests me more. And again, to make another reference, Ajay Guravarti's work is quite well known to many of you, most of you, or all of you perhaps. Guravarti is also making similar propositions. You have Ghansam Singh's article on caste and Hindutva in the Economic and Political Weekly, where Singh is talking about how hideous this politics is, how ambivalent RSS is, because RSS doesn't have a sustained, committed social reforms movement as far as caste is concerned, and yet at the level of politics they do some tokenism, and that is the way they sort of appropriate Dalit voices, etc., etc. Now, again, this is a top-down approach. This doesn't really take into account how Dalits approach Hindutva. It talks subtly about how Hindutva approaches Dalits, and these are propositions that might be making a lot of sense from that perspective, but doesn't really make doesn't help us in order to understand the perspective of Dalits as far as their passion for, or at least enthusiasm of some level for the Hindutva ideologies. Now, in order to look for some possible answers, I was not just looking into the empirical part of electoral politics and so on. I did some sort of data research and so on, although I'm not a trained sociologist, I'm a humanities guy. But I did some of that research because it is kind of helpful. So there is some sort of study of electoral politics there. But my primary interest is in the text. So I took some effort to read Binayak Damodar Savarkar. Now, before I get into Savarkar and eventually to Ambedkar, let me tell you that there is a great deal of difference between other Hindutva ideologues like Hegdewar and Golwalkar and Savarkar. This is not to just say that, imply in some sense that Savarkar is better than them or worse than them. It's simply to underscore the fact that Hindutva brigade is also not a monolith. And one of the first mistakes that we often end up doing is to create, just as they create tags, labels like urban nakshals and anti-nationals and so on, we also create, many of us, I'm assuming that we are mostly left liberal people, loosely speaking, we also tend to monolithize them. But there is a great deal of difference. If you read Golwalkar and if you read Savarkar and sort of juxtapose their writings, you realize that there is a great deal of difference. Now, what kind of difference? These are points that are related to the caste question. So one of the primary things that I'm going to talk about out of this quite a considerably large sort of corpus of Savarkar's writings is how he talks about the caste question within the Hindu Rashtra project, within the Hindutva project, within that sort of a nationalist enterprise. And that is why I put the word nationalism in the title of my talk today. So one of the things that I noticed is in Savarkar's writings, as far as caste is concerned, caste and Hindutva is concerned, is that he is quite an anti-caste voice. He is, and this is an apparent sort of common sense perception of an anti-caste person. He says that I'm all for intercaste marriages. Think of an Hindutva ideologue who is talking about intercaste marriages. He is not really bothered if caste is put to an end. He is talking about interdining. He is completely against untouchability. One might raise an Ambedkarite sort of apprehension here, and I might say that it's somewhat like Gandhi, who was ready to fight against untouchability, but was not ready to find any flaw with the caste system as such. And I believe Hindutva ideologues, by and large, suffer from that same problem. It's not just unique to Gandhi. Most people of that generation who participated in some kind of nationalist discourse had that sort of a problem, including Tagore is not exempted from that list. Even Tagore in Nationalism in India essay or the lecture that he delivered in the US talks about the degeneration model of caste, wherein he says that caste as such, as a system of social management, wasn't really a bad thing, but eventually degenerated into something terrible, gave birth to untouchability and all sorts of problems. It became very stringent and restrictive and suffocating. And that is why we need to do something about it. That's the way he approached it. But we are not really discussing Tagore here. So I'll get back to Savarkar. Savarkar, in his collected writings, translated by his biographer Bikram Sampath, talks about, in one of these volumes, volume 7 of Savarkar Sangraha, where Savarkar is giving us the 7 problems that the nation, the Hindu Rashtra is suffering from. He calls them Saptabandi. So I'll just quickly read that list. One, Vedokta Bandi. This is about Vedas and how we have excluded the untouchables and lower castes from having access to the Vedic literatures. Then Vyavashaya Bandi. We have been very restrictive when it comes to the professional lives of our Hindu Rashtra people. And then third is Sparsha Bandi. This is about untouchability, as the name suggests. Samudra Bandi, that's the 4th one. And Shuddhi Bandi, this is about his discomfort with the lack of proselytizing missions in Hindu religious dispensation, Hinduism, because he thinks conversion is a good policy. Christianity has it, Islam has it, why can't Hinduism also have it? Then Roti Bandi, it is about interdining. He is uncomfortable with the fact that Hindus practice untouchability, they don't interdine, and that's a problem for him. Then Beti Bandi, this is about intercaste marriages, and so on. So these are the 7 shackles, he calls them, of the Hindu society. So he is on one hand uncomfortable with the caste system. He is all for intercaste marriages, he is for interdining, he is for abolishing untouchability. And in that sense, in somewhat a more crude sense, rather if you compare it to Ambedkar's radicalism, that he can be perceived as an anti-caste person. Now, how is this possible? Because the general idea, the common sense assumption about Savarkar and Hindutva ideology in general is that they don't do much, as Ghanshyam Singh suggests in his EPW article, that they don't do anything about caste. They don't want to do away with the caste system. And that is by and large true. I'm not dismissing it at all, because the large body of Hindutva discourse actually tells us how obsessed they are with the caste system, and with they have tendencies to perpetuate it endlessly. So there is no anti-caste vision as such. I'm not saying that Hindutva ideologies can come up with some kind of anti-caste vision, but this is something that is there, and it would be stupid for us to be blind to this literature of Savarkar. Now, but this doesn't explain the questions that I asked. So how is it that the Dalits feel so passionate about this? Because apart from the reform measures that Savarkar proposes, we must also take note of the fact that he is not really engaged with it. It's one thing to talk about these Saptabandis or 7 shackles of the Hindu society in his writings, and it's quite another thing to actually bring about social reform movements in order to annihilate caste, in order to destroy the caste system. That is where there is a great deal of absence of Savarkar's enthusiasm. But what is striking in Savarkar's writing, if you look at caste, especially within the Hindutva context, is that for him the Hindu identity, or to be more specific, Hindutva identity is not a social, religious, cultural one. He's categorical about this. He's very clear about it. He's repetitive about this particular aspect of his definition of the Hindutva ideology, or what Hindutva means. He is constantly reiterating this point in his writings, and he says that Hinduism is not what I'm really bothered about. It has got its problems, but Hindutva is something that is I'm bothered about, that is what I'm concerned about, and that is where everybody is an equal. So we have an apparently social identity or a socio-religious identity which is completely taken out of its socio-religious context and transformed into something that is essentially political, that is out and out political. It is not simply, and there is a great deal of possibility of misunderstanding what Savarkar is suggesting and how I'm looking at it. So let me clarify this once again. It is not simply about what Shashi Tharoor is saying, that Hinduism is this not is a pluralist sort of domain. You can have all sorts of sects and fractions within the so-called Hindu society, and Hindutva is a vulgar politicization of that identity. I'm simply following Savarkar. I'm underscoring the fact that within Savarkar's Hindutva ideology, Hindutva is essentially political, completely, almost in his political imagination, completely dissociated from anything that has to do with the socio-religious idea of Hinduism as such, right? So, and this is his strategy in order to make the caste question completely irrelevant, defunct, null and void. So, on one hand, it is true that he is talking against caste. He is talking about the Saptabandis, within which there are at least 3 or 4 bandis or shackles that are related to the caste question. But at the same time, Savarkar is proposing something far more interesting. He is saying that Hindutva has got nothing to do with Hinduism. And it is this dissociation of Hindutva, almost complete dissociation from Hinduism, that we come across in his Hindutva ideology, that interests me. Why? Because it is something through which he can then render the caste question completely blunt. It is irrelevant to his project. So I'm coming back to Meghwanshi in a short while, and I'll conclude with Ambedkar and how Ambedkar perceives nationalism, etc. very quickly. So I'll probably wrap up in 5 minutes. So Savarkar is creating this dissociation, this sort of differentiation from Hindutva and Hinduism. From Hindutva is dissociated from Hinduism. That is a point that I wanted to underscore. And once he does that, he says that for me, therefore, caste doesn't matter. I can quote extensively from his writings. I have those writings with me right now, but for the paucity of time, I'll exclude that. If there is a Q&A after this session, I'll be happy to discuss some of them or even quote from it. From his writings. But that is how he renders the caste question completely different. So as far as the political identity of Hindutva is concerned, the Dalit is a Hindutva guy, a Muslim is also a Hindutva guy. Let me go to that extent because that's also there in his text. He says that Muslims are also one of my primary concerns, as if he is a Muslim social reformer, political reformer, trying his best to save the Muslims from going into the wrong directions. He is talking about Turkish leaders, how Turkey actually went ahead in embracing Western science and rationality, and they were not shying away from critiquing Islamic texts like Quran, etc. And that is the path that Indian Muslims should also follow if they have to become citizens of the Hindu Rashtra in a true sense, right? So that slogan, which is very common to political cultures in northern India, much of northern India, Hindustan mein rehna hai to Hindu ban ke rehna hoga. This Hindu is not just the socio-religious Hindu. I'm not entirely discarding that possibility either, but as far as this literature is concerned, as far as Savarkar's texts are concerned, that is the political imagination that we come across. And because it is a political identity, because it is not so you can be at the receiving end of social discrimination, caste discrimination in your social life, in the realm of the social. But when it comes to the political, you are an important stakeholder. It is as if the compromises that you have to make, the adjustments and sufferings that you have to go through, that you have to experience, make in your social religious life, can be, to some extent at least, compensated by giving you a political stake in the larger, grand, epic project of building a Hindu Rashtra, right? So that is, in my reading of Savarkar's writings, I think that is how he makes the caste question almost completely irrelevant to the political project of Hindutva. And Ghansam Singhs should not be complaining as to why these RSS and other political right-wing organizations do not bother much about social reforms, because social reforms is irrelevant to them. So what we essentially come across here at a somewhat more abstracted note is a dissociation of the social from the political, right? But when it comes to Ambedkar, now let me get into a very quick reference to Ambedkar. When it comes to Ambedkar, we come across a very different idea of the social and the political in relation to the caste question. And if you look at his writings, so there are 2 points I'm going to make, and with which I'll conclude. A, if you go through Ambedkar carefully, despite the fact that Ramchandra Guha and other historians have often projected him, rightly so, as makers of modern India, as one of the founding fathers of the modern nation state of India, it is also true, if you read his texts carefully, he's quite an anti-colonial voice. That is not a point that is usually underscored by most of the post-colonial studies thinkers like Partha Chatterjee and Dipesh and others. But this is an important point. He's also a very anti-colonial voice. If you read some of his texts, you don't have to go through all the texts. You can just take out some parts of the essential writings of B.R. Ambedkar edited by Valerian Rodrigues, and you come across those references. He's quite a solid voice when it comes to anti-colonial discourse, but that has been undermined in our post-colonial studies classrooms. That's another point. But he is somebody who is also very critical about nationalism. We talk about how Tagore was critical about nationalism, how he was critiquing the nation state, the idea of the nation state, and calling it a mechanical one as opposed to a society which is a spontaneous one. We are familiar with Gandhi's critiques of these things. A modern nation state is an aggressive machine-like existence. We know these things, but we also should know that Ambedkar was also at the same time critiquing the idea of the nation state. You leaf through the pages of his texts like Thoughts on Pakistan, Pakistan, the Partition of India, where he comes up with radical critiques of both Jinnah and Savarkar, and at the same time, while doing so, he is giving us a critique of nationalism. And that critique of nationalism is, in my opinion, largely influenced by Dewey's critique of nationalism, wherein Dewey says, John Dewey, his teacher at Columbia, he says that nationalism is a double-edged sword. It's a kind of sword that on one hand it talks about fellow filling, it talks about cutting, putting differences, social differences on the carpet within a particular territorialized space. But beyond that, it creates animosity. So as Indians, we should be united, but we should also hate Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and so on. That is how it works. And that is a definition of nationalism, or a critique of nationalism, that we come across in Dewey's writings. And in my Dewey studies essay, I have talked about it. And that is something that is reiterated by Ambedkar in Thoughts on Pakistan. So here is a voice who is critical about that aggressive nationalism that Savarkar was so passionately obsessed with. That's one. And this last one is this idea of the social and the political. Ambedkar, in his 1949 Constituent Assembly speech, was constantly talking about how we will be living a life of contradiction. That is to say, in our social lives, we will have inequality. In our political life, in pen and paper, through the Constitution, we will have a life of equality. And there is a great deal of mismatch. And Ambedkar is assuming that at some point of time, the social will overtake, that the overshadow the political, so much so that the social differences will be completely translated into a political realm. And that is how he perceives the social and the political. So for Ambedkar, the distancing that we saw in Savarkar is actually not something to subscribe to. So he doesn't subscribe to that Savarkar type understanding of the social and the political, wherein the political has to be distanced from the social. Ambedkar is more of a thinker who thinks almost along Hannah Arendt's line. We can talk about Arendt's essay on the reflection on the Little Rock episode. And if we think of that essay, we realize that there are three sort of spheres that Arendt talks about: the private sphere, the political realm, and the social realm. And the social realm is somewhere in between, constantly negotiating with the political and the private. So Ambedkar is somewhat having similar anxieties about the social, He is constantly afraid of a possibility wherein the social differences will overshadow
Kollan, I'm
the other side.
interrupting. Srirupa wants to
Yeah,
say
I will
something.
wrap up. I'll wrap up. So in that sense, I think Ambedkar's product reforms is his negotiation with the caste question is radically different from that of Savarkar. I can sort of go on this, but I think I should stop here for Subro to deliver his speech. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kollan.
Yeah.
Subro is the last speaker for today before we open it up for question and answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Srirupa. Is it audible?
Yeah.
Clearly. Right? Okay. So I won't be taking much time to introduce my paper because it's a bit big paper, and I will be needing at least 30 to 35 minutes. And I could have discussed it, but I don't want to discuss it because there are certain details, certain historical concerns which I want to share also. And that's why I'm just directly going into the paper and starting reading the paper. The title of my paper is Caste and the Infrastructural Question, the Incomplete Project of Democracy. Before I start, I would thank Ritudi for inviting me in this important event organized by Department of Sociology, West Bengal State University. I'm thankful to Ritudi and also Shrupadi, who has read the paper, and I'm eagerly looking for her feedback on our papers and the discussion and all the suggestions that are coming from the audience and the listeners. So I'm starting with my paper. Thinking caste today calls for engaging with its spectrality. Since the dawn of the democracy was supposed to bring together every individual equally, but the continuity of caste prejudices and violence is a haunting reminder of the incompleteness of that project. Under this situation, a situation which has historically unfolded, addressing caste through purely empirical lens remains inadequate to examine the roots of the problem, especially because the concept of caste is after all an idea that finds its material presence through embodiment. One can recall here the division between means and end that Ambedkar had emphasized in his essay, Caste in India, Their Mechanism, Genesis and Development. Though the essay was pointing at the role of endogamy and surplus body, we can extend the means and end division to realize that even endogamy is also an embodied idea that one practices in their material existence. It reminds us again of the materialization of idea that finds its existence in everyday life through corporeal figurations. However, an idea that has been in circulation and practice for ages gets embodied as truth. It is this aspect of caste as an embodied idea that gets sedimented through historical shifts as the essence of Hinduism. Such sedimentation of idea that survives through historical shifts also encounters possibilities of its own disruption. However, in the case of caste, such disruptive moments had been appropriated in various junctures of history, with the result that caste survives even within the democratic framework of equality. It is to examine such survival of caste that I attempt in this paper to engage briefly with the doubleness of the nation-making project that started unfolding from 19th century and paradoxically found its settlement within the post-colonial democratic nation-state. Extending Sudipta Kaviraj's views on the role of an ideological principle of organization in the making of a dominant version of Bangla literature in 19th century, I attempt here to show how such ideological organizing principle has continued to shape the persistence of caste by linking it with an hegemonic concept of Hindu nation. To trace such making, I briefly turn towards the histories of 19th century Bengal and the emergence of an early framework of majoritarian Hindu nationalism, the unresolved tensions within which resonate today in recurring forms of embodied perspectives. However, engaging with the vernacular here also offers a reminder of the multiple forms of dwelling within a community, which otherwise is often reduced within a singular dominant framework of the nation. The point to focus thereby is an underlying logic of reductionism that tends to reduce one's imagination of democracy in terms of a dominant framework of Hindu nation and its embodied caste hierarchies. Engaging with the question of caste, therefore, calls today for a cautionary awareness of its historical unfolding and spectrality. And it is with such awareness that one needs to rethink what actually the concept of annihilation called for. The paper pushes towards a reconceptualization of such possibilities not as some messianic promise, but as an ethico-political necessity that one needs to keep cultivating both within the individual as well as within the community. And that is where the paper aims to reflect, as one possible way among others, on the suspending and transforming capacities of aesthetic education and humanities. The making of the organized framework of a dominant Hindu nationalism in early 19th century required essentially an ideological organizing principle that would simultaneously perform two tasks. Number one, resolving and appropriating contradictions, and number two, dismissing the irresolvable tensions in a way that doesn't affect the framework. And this was done through the constitution and separation of conceptual boundaries between what is interior and exterior. It was through the making of such organizing principle that the Persian and Musalmani elements in Bangla was excluded as foreign, and an added emphasis was brought to establish the affinities between Bangla and Sanskrit, thereby constituting and elevating a selected version of national character by paradoxically continuing the Orientalist model of Sanskritization of Indian past. This reminds us of the politics of constituting singular national frameworks through which systematic exclusions, through systematic exclusions that gets buried under the weight of changing times, and over the corpse of which new national identities are framed. As an early reminder of such exclusion, one may turn towards the heterodox or Nastika systems of ancient Indian philosophy, which are usually avoided to emphasize on the centrality of Vedic thought and therefore to establish uncritically the spiritual links between Hinduism and caste hierarchies. In this regard, early examples of Lokayata and Mimamsa may be mentioned, which keeps on reminding us of the impossibility of reducing ancient Indian past within any fixed singular framework. As highlighted by Romila Thapar, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, Ramkrishna Bhattacharya, and many others, even in such early times, the establishment of a hegemonic worldview or idea always mutually depended on material concerns and power structures of a society that had direct links with enjoyment of privileges and surplus product. Even in such early cases, we are reminded continuously how emphasizing on lofty spiritualistic idea as one's essential and unavoidable dharma had direct relations with caste-based material distribution and regulation of labor. The king dependent on the priests and their claim to secret spiritual knowledge for guidance and assurance, while the priest dependent on the king for material benefits. The king-priest collaboration ensuring the control of material privileges within them, while the lower castes continue to produce for them without having any claim over the surplus material he is producing, since this is his destiny. That is, he must serve for the upper castes without having any claim of his own. Even in such early times, any questioning of such system of caste-based distribution of labor was not just a questioning of the hegemonic religious systems of thought, but more importantly, a disruption of the established material socio-political hierarchies, and therefore either has been eventually contained within the dominant Vedic framework of Hinduism or has been dismissed as heretic and immoral. In different junctures of history, we see how there had been an underlying tendency to think Hinduism only through the Vedic hegemony and disregarding the diverse heterodox trends characterizing ancient Indian past, all of which have not always emphasized on the centrality of caste. Traces of such heterodox systems of thought can also be found in the later times as well. For example, the Bhakti cult of Chaitanya and Sahajiya Vaishnavism in 16th and 17th century Bengal. As Hitesh Ranjan Sannal and many other scholars have pointed out, the figure of Chaitanya and his trace on Dasya or the mood of being the servant of God, offered not just a different form of religious practice within Hinduism, but also created a sense of corporeal collectivity and camaraderie, since the collective singing of kirtans also provided a sense of collective spirit that was missing among the marginalized lower castes. In the words of Ramkanta Chakraborty, it enabled an environment of spiritual democracy. Similarly, the Sahajiya Vaishnavism tradition, which had directly influenced by Buddhist Tantric tradition, refused to believe in any transcendental views except the attainment of bliss through corporeal sensation. Though later both these trends were incorporated within a dominant version of Vaishnavism that accepted Varnashram Dharma and ritualism, yet they remind us simultaneously of the continuity of heterodox religious practices within Hinduism, especially Tantra and Dehopad, as well as their appropriation or rejection by the Vedic hegemony within Hinduism. These few examples can be seen as crucial reminder of the historical sedimentation and embodiment of a hegemonic framework of Hinduism premised on the centrality of Vedic thought and Varnashram Dharma that has continued to control the general imagination of Hinduism in such ways that different theological positions have either been appropriated or have been dismissed as heretic, licentious, or immoral. The turn of the 19th century posed an urgency for framing a nationalist ideology that would enable organizing the masses under one conceptual umbrella. Therefore, a re-evaluation of the past and tradition was essential. And here we see a selective reassertion of the Vedic and Upanishadic traditions. Interestingly, not the heterodox or Nastika systems of thought. Even the Orientalists like Max Muller and Colebrook had repeatedly emphasized on the essentially pluralistic character of Hinduism. The reason for such selection was the reassertion of a certain framework of spirituality and the linking of it with the duty of the individual as his essential dharma. By the time we reach mid-19th century, the task of the native intellectual was therefore to enable a form of synthesis between a binary that exposure to Western ideas has brought within the native society, between tradition and modernity, scientific rationality and religion, spirituality and material prosperity. Caste in such making always operated as an anomaly, as the Western ideals of equality stood absolutely against the logic of hierarchy and predetermination of that caste stood for, and therefore newer ways of justifying caste system was sought. Even some would read Western ideas for linking them with caste system, as for example did Jogendra Chandra Ghosh by using Comtean positivism for justifying caste hierarchies and Brahman rule. The colonial contact and circulation of capital, along with exposure to Western education, had brought significant changes within the existing caste-based occupations, enabling many of the lower caste groups to rise economically with newer occupational avenues. Added to that was the increasing number of conversions by poor untouchable castes, who, to escape the tyranny of caste discrimination within Hinduism, were turning increasingly towards Christianity or Islam. Therefore, though different phases of such making of the nationalist project in colonial Calcutta, we see various curious attempts to modify or appropriate caste as an essential element of Hindu tradition with modernity. And this was done by the linking of jati with a collective framework of jatiyo or national, and to establish such linking, the same Orientalist philological explanations of Aryan race was used. As Shekhar Bandyopadhyay reminds, this marked a crucial phase whereby the volatility of the concept of jati within pre-colonial systems of social organization went a double reduction. Firstly, under the lens of colonial anthropology, and secondly, by framing it within a category of jatiyo. This constituted a central move towards the making of the Hindu nationalism, whereby violating one's jati got linked with violating the jatiyo or national responsibility. Therefore, though sati and widow remarriage was often debated between and separated the liberals from orthodox sections, the thinking of absolute dissolution of caste was unthinkable for both sections due to the embodied belief that one's caste stood for one's lineage and roots, and therefore to absolutely give away caste means giving away one's national identity, community, and religion, a view that is cherished by many even today as well. Those elites who absolutely rejected caste hierarchies, as example the members of Young Bengal group who openly consumed beef and wine, were dismissed as corrupt and immoral. Ram Mohan therefore would never dine openly with British officials and was even accompanied by a Brahmin cook in his visit to England to ensure that no one raises question on the purity of his caste. However, those elites who violated caste boundaries also could be appropriated within the caste order by paying handsome amounts as praschat to the powerful Brahmin communities, which led a contemporary elite Ramdulal Dey to even declare that his caste was in his cash box. Violation of caste boundaries therefore was seen as a very serious crime, and regulatory bodies led by upper caste elites such as Jatimala Kachari or different Sabhas and Samaj were created to regulate such transgression. While in the newly formed elite urban spaces of colonial Calcutta, Capital was the central factor in determining caste regulations and transgressions. In the suburban areas and villages, lower caste protests were also emerging strongly. As for example, the Bolohari sect among the Haris of Nadia district, the Koch or Rajvanshis of North Bengal, the Bhuimalish of Moimongsinho district, among many others, all of which, as thinkers like Partha Chatterjee and Shekhar Bandyopadhyay have shown, though contained the possibilities of constituting an alternate domain of politics, were contained within the dominant framework of Hinduism. Such eruption of contradictions within the established caste order was a serious concern in the making of an emergent Hindu nationalism. Therefore, while the Persian, Islamic and colonial influences in Indian culture was constituted and dismissed as foreign elements, caste question was dismissed as an internal religious tension and not one of serious political concern. Since caste couldn't be dismissed as a foreign element, unlike the Muslim or colonizer question, it continued to operate as an internal contradiction and anomaly within the established framework of Hindu nationalism. By the turn of 20th century, though the appropriation of this problem was attempted by denying it a political status, the depressed classes movement continues to problematize the emergent nationalist assurances. Therefore, when Srinath Datta argued in an article in Navya Bharat that in the Congress, every caste from Brahman to Bagri or from Kayastha to Keora had equal rights, the hollowness of such words was very clear. Scientist Prafulla Chandra Rai too dismissed the call for political reform of caste as unnecessary by asserting that there was no fear of Brahmin rule in a future nation state. And similarly, Meghnad Saha and grammarian Madhusudan Kabbo Bakarantirtha also emphasized the caste question as a social problem and not a political one. In fact, within many of these early 20th century intellectuals, there was a deeply held trust in a reimagined caste system representing a moral social order that differentiated India from the modern Western models of social organization. In such scenario, the caste question was continuously refused to be taken as an urgent political problem, and whenever it was considered, the central concern remained something else. For example, one of the central concerns during the phase of decolonization was the fear of losing the Hindu identity to a Muslim majoritarian nation state. This was a fear that was earlier expressed in 19th century by Ishwar Gupta, when as Western education was seen as a corrupting influence on the caste, thereby corrupting Hindu identity and nation itself. And I quote, যেহেতু হিন্দু কলেজের হিন্দুত্ব আর রক্ষা হয় না, এই কলেজের শাখা যাহা হার সাহেবের স্কুল বলিয়া বিখ্যাত, পূর্বেই সেই শাখার দুটো পোকা ধরিয়া প্রশাখা ও পল্লব পর্যন্ত নষ্ট করিতেছে। তাহার একটি পোকা ইসুর খোকা, একটি পোকা মোহাম্মদের খোকা। উক্ত পোকা কি প্রকার কোথা হইতে আইল তা ভাবিয়া চিস্তিয়া আমরা বোকা হইয়াছি। এই কীট ইহার পর ভস্যকীট হইয়া মূল শুদ্ধ ধ্বংস করিবে। This was from his editorial from Sangbad Prabhakar, which can be roughly translated as, the Hindutva of Hindu college is under threat. A branch of this college, which is known as Hare Sahib School, is already affected by two insects, which are destroying it slowly. One of that insect is an offspring of Christ, another one of Muhammad. We have wasted our time thinking the history of these insects. These insects might later destroy the entire roots of the tree. These lines, as if resonate directly, many arguments that we hear today, through which similar fear is continuously instilled within common people. Similar fear was expressed also in 20th century with the publication of books like U.N. Mukherjee's Hindu the Dying Race, 1912, Swami Shraddhananda's Hindu Sanghatan, Savior of the Dying Race, 1926, and the formation of Hindu Mahasabha in 1933. While we see echoes of similar fears continuously fueling the narrative of Hindutva, we need to realize how deeply embodied such fear is within the imagination of the common people to repeat almost similar concerns even today. A specific framework of Hinduism that had dominated people's imagination for so many generations cannot change itself suddenly, and therefore, at different junctures of historical change, such embodied views have found its settlements in newer ways, be it in the shaping of the idea of nation or one's identity. As Sumanta Banerjee points, such historical continuity of the appropriation of what is otherwise different from the dominant hegemony of Vedic Hinduism offers certain crucial reminders in the present times, when one can find similar attempts to appropriate descent within certain dominant frameworks of understanding. However, in such context as in the present times, where we see the continuity of linking caste with an India's spiritual past and Hinduism, we need to remember the historical sedimentation of such embodied views since 19th century. By asserting that, while I attempt briefly to dislocate the recent claims of making a majoritarian Hindu nation as a thought that is not immediately new, it also offers a cautionary reminder how immediately available solutions may not be able to get rid of a problem that had unfolded with long continuing historicity. A fact that Ambedkar was deeply aware of, and I quote, "I may seem hard for Manu, but I am sure my force is not strong enough to kill his ghost. He lives like a disembodied spirit and is appealed to, and I am afraid will yet live long," unquote. In the making of the nationalist project in 19th century, the economically deprived untouchable castes remained trapped in the double bind of colonial administration and majoritarian nationalism. And the dawn of democracy was not being able to change that situation. Where being torn every day between poverty and embodied violence, the Dalits are forced to suffer social ostracism silently. The continuity of such deeply embodied views not just affect rational thinking, but also infrastructural changes. And the predominance of such embodied views haunts as a reminder of the incompleteness of the nation-making project. The haunting echo of Ambedkar's reminder of the Bohishkrut Bharat or quarantined India within the Purishkrut Bharat or sacred India. Such situation of doubleness continues to shape the infrastructural concerns in a way that creates a sense of alienation for the marginalized others. A situation that is beautifully expressed by Bhabha using Toni Morrison's poem as an experience of being the foreigner in one's own home. A situation that was also echoed earlier in the title of Ambedkar's work, Untouchables or the Children of India's Ghetto. Being aware of the historical continuity of caste problem and the inability to find some immediate solution to the problem and the doubleness characterizing the post-colonial nation, Ambedkar was skeptical of both political reform and democratic assurance. Annihilation meant absolute end of caste system, and Ambedkar was certain that in the present framework of a dominant Hinduism, such absolute annihilation of caste was impossible because of the deeply held trust in embodied views of caste. Ambedkar was aware of the doubleness of the Hindu nationalist project that started unfolding from 19th century and found its settlement within post-coloniality in the form of a majoritarian Hindu nation and its casteism. This was definitely not a democratic solution that Ambedkar dreamed for, and many passages from his Annihilation of Caste clearly shows that his ideal was one of democratic equality, where there won't be any hierarchical emphasis on separation of varnas, and the common identity of every individual would be only in terms of a pure abstraction of citizenship. This is what I call the incomplete project of democratic nation-making that Ambedkar had in his mind, and therefore conceptualizing the historical unfolding of caste problem directly infuses today with the infrastructural question of democracy. The infrastructural question of post-coloniality that Spivak presses on in her book An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, when seen from the perspective of caste, reminds us continuously of such ontological echoes of past within the present. We can recall here her point that the British and the caste Hindu reformers only concentrated on the visible violence of sati and passed a widow remarriage law without any infrastructural involvement. In the question of caste, the only limited infrastructural option that was available to Ambedkar at the time of decolonization was that of ensuring some reservations and legal rights to safeguard the Dalits and backward sections from suffering material deprivations and violence that an otherwise majoritarian upper caste Hindu society and its embodied casteism could have practiced. And the continuity of caste discrimination and violence proves that at every juncture. However, as emphasized already, Ambedkar's actual ideal was democracy, and this is where we have failed to cultivate the values of equality properly. As Spivak reminds us in the context of capital, the value for Marx was essentially abstract, and therefore had the potentiality for a revolution to come, provided its transformative and volatile capacities are realized properly by the proletariat. However, the problem was with Engels' translation of Marx and the reductionism operating there, the decisive cuts through which the folded togetherness of value was reduced within a decisive empiricism of exchange value only. And that is where the history of the left goes unfair. I humbly submit, similar is the problem of translatability of the value of democracy between what Ambedkar had conceptualized and what instead came to us through the lens of the embodied majoritarian Hindu nationalism. As Spivak reminds, and I quote, "Real change must be epistemic rather than merely epistemological, home as well as school. All these efforts, however carefully undertaken by the engaged intellectual, is offset by the development of ethical and epistemic semiosis in the subaltern household, cradled in an often traumatic child rearing, which is so deeply involved in the lessons of millennial class apartheid and gender division that it continuously creates the problem one is trying to solve, unquote. If ethics is to conceptualized as a problem of relation rather than a problem of knowledge, it is not enough to build purely empirical databases. Rather, what is required is an act of relation and suspension. And to perform that, one needs a training of the imagination to realize the suspending potentials of imagination, to be able to think of one's own self from an other's perspective, or in other words, to lose oneself in an other's self. This is a transforming capacity that doesn't foreclose itself according to any hegemonic framework. Instead, this is a play that one participates in not to control, but to lose oneself. And I quote, "When one decides to speak of double binds and aporias, one is haunted by the ghost of the undecidable in every decision. Again, it must be insisted that this is the condition of possibility of deciding. In the aporia of the double bind, to decide is the burden of responsibility. The typecast of the ethical sentiment is regret, not self-congratulation. Any trick to train them into a mental habit of othering rather than merely provide them with tools to destroy. In the othering of the self and coming as close as possible to accessing the other as the self," unquote. I submit this is also the language of democracy which we have failed to translate. To understand the self in terms of the other, to entail the ethical within the political. If caste is the embodiment of an hegemonic idea, then the possibility of its annihilation lies in crossing over the double bind within which we are trapped today. And herein comes the necessity of stressing on the conscious training of imagination in the habits of democracy. It is towards such directions, among other possible routes, that I stress on the importance of aesthetic education and critical humanities for the training of imagination. Standing at a juncture where we are witnessing the rise of another wave of majoritarian Hindu nationalism, where newer forms of caste discriminations recur every day, where laws don't stand for ensuring the values of equality, such stress on the onto-epistemological necessity for the training of imagination in the language and values of democracy acquires an ethico-political necessity, so as to make grounds for a futurity to come that realizes the values of democracy. Otherwise, and I quote to conclude, "In the absence of a people educated in the habits of democracy, there are no constraints upon the vanguard," unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Subro, for your presentation. So the way Ritu and I had thought about organizing the rest of today is that I'll make a few comments. Can all of you hear me?
Yes.
I'll just make a few comments. And after I make those comments, we will open up the panel for discussion. There have some questions have been coming in, so we will give those questions to the speakers, presenters, and then have the space for carrying on forward some of the debates that have been reflected upon since yesterday. Let me read my comments. Thank you, Professor Shen Chaudhuri and the Department of Sociology at West Bengal State University for inviting me to be the discussant for this panel. Thank you, Dr. Titit Chatterjee, for attending to the minute but essential details of this webinar and helping us to remain tuned in during these 3 hours. I had the pleasure of reading and listening to 4 thought-provoking papers which talk to each other in productive ways. A number of interconnected themes run across these 4 papers: religion, nation, writing or representation, violence, space and time, memory and forgetting. Both Saha and Dash offer critiques of caste as the purported essence of a religion and nation. Biswas and Sengupta raise the critical issue of representation of caste experiences and its dismal failure in narratives of nation, development, and civic life. All the papers offer analyses of how violence constitutes the structure of a caste society, which break down only in small jolts when it can't be contained anymore in the everyday experiences of a Monoranjan Bapari or a Budhin Machin. All the papers talk about spaces in relation to caste in India. The space of the developmental discourse of a modern nation in which the image and life of a Santhal girl is carried around as a political cultural resource, or the space of the cage-like city that Monoranjan Bapari dwells in. While the above-mentioned themes constitute the conceptual ingredients of the papers, there are certain ideas and concepts which run almost as an underbelly in all these papers. The uncanny and haunting, the idea of being tossed around, what Biswas calls the portability, the sedimented infrastructure of caste as an organizing principle of Indian society, and the middle path or Madhyam path that Dr. Ambedkar talked about in Das's paper. Or here we can think about the middle ground as that space between caste as a political space and caste as a social space that Das just presented right now in his paper. My question to the presenters is this: can we develop these, these concepts and ideas that run as the underbelly as methodological tools and constantly kind of unstable or destabilize their more powerful and visible counterparts? Nation, religion, and society are the conceptual blocks we use for social analysis. But these same spatial and temporal categories are also those spaces and concepts against which particular subjectivities and their social worlds keep breaking their heads. In keeping that in mind, I would like to push forth a couple of issues that run through these papers. And not only for the authors of the papers, but as we engage in questions of getting an access to these other socials that Professor Guru and Sarukai have been talking about. Samrat, you talk about the uncanny, you talk about the haunting in your previous paper as well as in the paper that you just presented. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Uncanny for whom? What work does uncanny do as an affect and politics? The uncanny, psychoanalytically, is at the same time the most intimate, private, comfortable, and yet the most concealed, hidden, or inaccessible. Do you think in your mind that we can use this uncanny as a methodological resource to open up the deeply interconnected but hidden social worlds that become visible to us only in certain moments, or what I call, jolts? Can then the uncanny show us not only what we do not see normally, but also destabilize the way in which we think seeing is possible? In other words, challenge the categories of social and cultural analysis? Kalyan, I apologize because I won't be able to comment on your present paper, but kind of carrying forth from the paper that you had sent me. I was wondering if similarly, this middle ground you talk about, that Dr. Ambedkar encourages us as a moral and political practice, can that middle ground be treated as a methodological and intellectual location placement as we try to access and name the caste social that Professor Guru and Professor Sarukai talk about? Subro, you start with the spectral and haunting, but quickly move in favor of the structuring ideological principle that makes caste a coherent set of ideas and practice. Why move away from spectrality? My question to you is the spectral or haunting a mere uncomfortable momentary disruption to a more durable structuring of caste as a totalizing entity? Can a dogged engagement with the organizing principle at the expense of the less stable and ephemeral leave out the complex and contradictory subjectivities of even those people who live in the direst of circumstances? Hardik, I really like the way you use this idea of portability or cartability, or, the way I was thinking about is kind of being really tossed around. That is a central framework for you to theorize the way in which Budhni Mejan's life and her story kept moving around in the Indian public sphere. Can this idea of being tossed around, getting lost, being found again, be treated as an analytic as we try to theorize that which is beyond signification frequently? How do we theorize such wandering, ephemeral life worlds and socials in which injury, suffering, and mourning are forever present? In linking the above questions and discussions going on in this webinar, I raise a sociological concern. How do we describe and analyze life, which is way more complicated and complex than those of us who study it have usually granted? What do we do when critical vocabularies fail us to communicate the depth, the density, and the intricacies of the dialectic of subjection and subjectivity, or, in sociological vocabulary, structure and agency of domination and freedom? How can we take imagination seriously in sociology, which is rather limited by its commitment to a restrictive empiricist epistemology and its supporting ontology of that which is concrete and visible? To make sense of what people do and why, as well as to do what they might do differently, sociology and more broadly, the social sciences cannot simply describe the vast and abstracted structures that compel and inhibit social action. We must also seek to detect how conditions in the past banished certain people, things, ideas, how circumstances rendered them excluded and repressed. Is it possible for sociology to engage sincerely in what is lost? What is lost but always present as living traces? As sociologists, can we befriend ghosts? By ghosts, I mean those apparitions, but also lost traces, subterraneans, and those just beside us spaces. As Avery Gordon says, ghosts are not simply dead or a missing person, but a living social figure, and investigating it might lead us to that dense site where history and subjectivity make social life. Might we learn new ways of knowing where listening is more important than seeing, and being attuned to hear the murmurs and echoes which might be lost, but still deeply constitute the worlds we inhabit. Thank you very much. Should I, put forth the questions that have come in, Ritu? What would the speakers like?
No, that is, I don't know actually. It's up to the speakers, but as per my opinion, they may respond to you first, and then we can move on to other questions. There are a few other questions in the chat box.
Yes.
We can also read them out, and that's up to the speakers. I mean.
Should I respond? Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Srirupa ji, for your comments. But actually, like, I was not trying to shift from the spectral to a kind of a historical empirical, but I was rather trying to emphasize that how within the conceptualization of existing histories, number one, there is an element of haunting, because I am trying to give history from a parallel two perspectives. On the one hand, I am showing an element of appropriation, but also the appropriation doesn't foreclose the possibility, the eruption of the different. And that's what I was also tracing simultaneously, that throughout the essay, from early heterodox systems to 19th century on, also, like, there are, like, if I talk about, let's say, even today also, we see that there is a continuous tendency to bring things within the dominant, within the hegemony, but also that doesn't foreclose the continuous eruption of the resistance, the continuous eruption of the voices. So as if this both forms of spectrality is coming. But the major point which I was trying to highlight is how, as if the different, the other, and that's what I was quoting Shumanto Mukhopadhyay's point, that how decent, let's say, decent is standing for a view of the alterity, a view of a different, but how decent, how the different opinion is as if not respected in that way, but rather is always, there are a priori parameters by which either it is dismissed or it is content, and this parameter is as if unfolded with a long continuity, and that's what I was using continuous to the concept of sedimentation. But at the same time, I was not able to develop that because of 30 minutes and that part. I also had I had in mind two very interesting Ambedkar memorial lectures. One is by Bhava and another is by Veena Das, where both of them talk about Agamben's concept of bare life and Hannah Arendt. And if I talk about that, let's say how a dominant form of political, let's say the difference between the biological and the political, where the political has the tendency to bereft the biological body from any political agency, from any political presence. That's what something which Sundar and Gopal Guru was also continuously explaining yesterday, that there is as if agentless agency that continues to strip a certain section of the biological from its existence within the political. In other words, that what Bhava calls as if it's a kind of a situation, and that's what I was talking about, the infrastructural, where you are within a kind of a legal framework, but still living within a legal framework, you are ripped out, you are excluded of any let's say judicial respect or any legal presence to matter. And that kind of an unfolding has not happened today. It has kind of continuously unfolded, and what I was trying to show is that what we see today is a kind of a sedimentation, and that's why we need to rethink our very roots, our very entries to how we try to think the political, how we try to bring, so like not just bringing that. That's what I was saying, and Ambedkar is also continuously referring to that not just an immediate solution may solve this problem, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be questioned, challenged. in different modalities, in different ways, and through that continuous forms of attempts to push the political, that as if newer forms of changes keeps on coming. This is what I remember Gopal Guru also has stressed in one of his JNU lectures, that how even that kind of a action may be a kind of a repetition, that questioning the agency, questioning the dominant is not something immediately new. And like what I am trying to say maybe has been attempted before, let's say in the question of race, let's say in the question of sexual discrimination, in different others, this kind of tendencies have been attempted in various ways. But still, we need to keep, even if required repeating, we need to keep on doing that, because that would also to a large extent create a sense of disruption within the, let's say, the historically continuing dominant. So that is what one side I was trying to give. But yeah, I need to develop the conceptualizing of the theory, the infrastructural mode, and that's why I look forward more to the suggestions.
May I, Srirupa? Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you, Srirupa, for your very detailed comments on all the papers. I was referring to, in my Divi Studies paper, I was referring to Madhyam Pantha, or some kind of a middle path, not simply in the popularly known Buddhist way, which is of course the way that Ambedkar would have probably loved to follow, or did follow in some sense. But I was having a different kind of implication when I was talking about Madhyam Pantha in my paper. I was primarily talking about how Ambedkar is placed almost always at the crossroad of different contradictory political philosophies. For instance, I see a definite aspect of conservative political thought in Ambedkar. There is an influence of Edmund Burke on Ambedkar, for instance. And I'm not the first one to sort of underscore this. If you read, I'm sure you have gone through this wonderful book by Chris Bailey, where Bailey talks about how all these major figures, it's a kind of intellectual history work where starting from Ram Mohan to Vidyasagar and Ambedkar or Vivekananda, Tagore, all of them are mixed sort of thinkers. There is no comprehensive liberalism as such with which we can associate or understand Ambedkar or Ambedkar's writings. For me, Ambedkar is somebody who certainly looks at the limits of liberalism and at the same time allows himself to be influenced by some of the, for him at least, reasonable critiques of liberalism done by conservatism. For instance, if you look at even Dewey, C.A. Macpherson's book on political thinkers, including there is a chapter in that book on Dewey, and Macpherson's book is a book that is cited extensively by Dipesh Chakraborty in Provincializing Europe's last chapter, where Dipesh is talking about the problem of historicism as he sees it in Gandhi, as he sees it in Ambedkar, and Dipesh is talking about Ambedkar's historicism, etc. And he thinks that Dewey's liberalism is the reason for Ambedkar's historicism. I would rather disagree with that line of thought, because I think following Bailey and following some of the recent works done by Aishwari Kumar's book Radical Equality, or to allow myself to be influenced by Ajay Skaria's book on Gandhi, Unconditional Equality. If we take into account these sort of recent works on Gandhi, on Ambedkar, I think we should realize that these are extremely complex thinkers who are constantly borrowing from different contradictory ideologies, constantly interacting with different contradictory ideologies. And this is also why I think I would like to congratulate Subro on his methodology, because Subro is doing something similar to that. And I think that is an intellectual inheritance that we should, and methodology perhaps, that we should borrow from Ambedkar and also work more in that sort of field in terms of methodological perspective. But I think, there is also something that I need to quickly underscore here, and I think Ambedkar's perceptions on many of the Western philosophies are not simply to be considered within the overarching Western Enlightenment modernity. I think he borrows heavily from different strands of thought within the Western world that are not following the overarching sort of aggressive Western rationality model. I remember a conversation at a chawl that Ambedkar had with the famous Indian English author Mulk Raj Anand. And in that sort of conversation, and kind of adda conversation that he had with Anand, Anand asked him about his intellectual inheritances, philosophical influences that have sort of determined his intellectual sphere. And he says nothing about the Western thinkers. He continuously speaks about Buddhism. He talks about Charvak. He talks about Lokayata Darshan. He talks about even Mimamsa and Shankho and Nyaya and so on. And Anand later on, sort of recapitulating that sort of conversation that he had with Ambedkar, Mulk Raj Anand says that, I was completely surprised to see that kind of Ambedkar who was not even interested to talk about Western thinkers like Kant or Hegel and so on. And somebody who was trained by John Dewey, one of the eminent philosophers of that time in America, he must have read these thinkers. So the very fact, the empirical fact that Ambedkar does not really bother to talk about these philosophers all the time and takes really, serious efforts, makes serious efforts to read Indian philosophies, actually make him a very interesting thinker who is not shying away from looking at the limits. In fact, in one of the prefatory notes that Ambedkar wrote to one of his books, Thoughts on Linguistic States, that's the book that not many sociologists and humanities scholars generally read because it has got so many tables and data and figures and so on. It's more like a policy document, and it is a policy document in many ways. In that preface to Thoughts on Linguistic States, Ambedkar actually says that many people often criticize me for being inconsistent, but I'm glad I'm consistent. To be consistent, that I'm not consistent, and to be consistent is the virtue of an ass, right? So that very strong words there. So he is somebody who is also ready to contradict his own earlier theses in order to actually get to the bottom of that problem, whether it is the problem of caste, whether it is a concern for democracy, and so on and so forth. I think that is the spirit in which I was referring to that phrase, Madhyam Pantha, middle path. Yeah.
If I just could add one thing, thank you, Kolyan, for giving such a good kind of explanation. Actually, that's what I kind of wanted to know, and I was precisely thinking about that. That middle ground, not only as middle ground is the safest ground, but whether that middle ground can really help us so as not to put certain thinkers and their work in kind of neat categories.
Absolutely, yes.
And, therefore kind of try to restrict them in terms of their analytical and methodological kind of significance.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So, Srirupa, can I respond?
Just a moment, Samrat. Just a moment. So, Srirupa, since we are running out of time, I think would it be good to share the questions first?
Yes.
And, so that they can respond to it all together.
Yes, absolutely. That's a much better idea, so that some of the questions are very, very interesting. So let me
so Kolyan, Samrat, sorry to interrupt you, but then we have to think of the kind of
So the first question is from Srija Noshkur. She's a research fellow at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences. This is for Samrat. Thoroughly enjoyed Samrat Sengupta's presentation. My question is for him. While formulating a paradigm of death and the experience of it that is inevitable in the construction of a Dalit subject, how does Sengupta wish to justify of not commenting simultaneously on the paradigm of life giving to a Dalit? Since he mentions Butler, there is an interesting book called Precarious Life, although written in a different context, where she talks of how some lives are rendered more unlivable and their deaths less grievable. Can a death-bound Dalit subject be separated from the precarity of living that he/she is always also bound in? That is the question for Samrat. Let me just put two other questions and then open them up for discussion. This question comes from Abir Mojumdar, research scholar at the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, Delhi. This is for Professor Kolyan Das. It is not per se directly related to the textual analysis of Savarkar's work, but can actually divorce his political Hindutva from his social practice, especially in the context of indulging the colonizer during a remarkably crunch phase of the anti-colonial struggle. Was his social construction not pro-imperial? And in relation to that, there is another question from Shipra, I don't know her last name, for Kolyan. I am curious to know your opinion on why Savarkar may have written of this non-caste Hindutva identity, since, as you said, they didn't really do much about it. Was it the same that led the Congress to enlarge the Hindu identity? And for Samrat, Shipra has also a question. My question for Samrat is this death-bound subject with the possibility of death as a consistent reality, would you say that this proximity to violence enables the Dalit to even as it kills? A number of Dalit stories authored now end with the violence being owned and wielded by the earlier oppressed Dalit, as in Bapari's story, Namora Manush.
Yeah, let me start responding.
Yeah, Samrat, go ahead.
I will include, I can include the questions asked by Srirupa as well.
Samrat, sorry to interrupt you. At the end of your response and my response, I would also have one brief response to Hardik's paper, and probably we can conclude the session after that. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So, Srirupa has rightly pointed out the question of the uncanny, though I did not focus on the uncanny in this paper. It was there in the earlier paper, but uncanny must have been felt throughout this paper as well, despite not being spoken. What I am trying to say is that uncanny, if you go back to the German word for uncanny, unheimlich, as Srirupa has already spelled out clearly, that unheimlich or uncanny, it can mean both the intimate and most known, and also the most unknown and alienating experience. So it's a coupling of the known and the unknown, and the German word unheimlich can mean both homely and unhomely at the same time. That I think both of us derive from Freud's famous essay, The Uncanny. And it is connected with my talk very much, because I was talking about the politics of dwelling, and the politics of dwelling in case of, there is some interruption, I don't know. Some microphone is on.
Kolyan, will you please mute yourself?
Yes, I'll do that. Just a second.
Now it is okay. So the uncanny is so the since I was talking about the spatial discrimination for the Dalit, where the Dalit is not given a space. Actually, this idea of non-space or the absence of space is something which is at the heart of the structure of democracy, which wants to secure and emplace certain lives at the cost of the other lives. So, which we don't want to incorporate and put in our language. And this will also relate to the question about precarious lives and how certain lives are livable and certain lives are made precarious. Connecting to this question of the uncanny, I will say that it is uncanny or something which makes uncomfortable, but also going back to the literal meaning of the word as this both homely and the unhomely coming together. I will try to say that what we think as familiar, as everyday, there is a sphere beyond that. And the as Butler has like described, the modern citizen subject has been given the right to live and the right to be secured. Not only the right to live, as Agamben proposes, but also in case of Butler, the right to be secured. That security is totally taken away in case of the Dalit subject. They are made precarious and vulnerable. And I will want to clarify that by death-bound subject, I did not specifically mean someone who is about to die or only the paradigm of death, but a paradigm where death always comes as a part of your consciousness. We know that in general, human thinking, death is something which is kept out of our thinking, and it is thought of as absolute. But as I have said in my paper, I was also talking about the concept of disaster. Disaster is something which brings death closer, but also makes death less comprehensible and complete. It makes less complete. Death is not a complete entity, but it is something in which we dwell. But in our everyday life, we don't consider dwelling within death or undwelling as such. So it is uncanny. And about Sripadi's query on the lost traces of or the ghosts which has to be brought back by the sociologist, I will say that definitely I completely agree with you. And this is a project which is being carried out in several spheres, not only in Dalit studies, but also in feminist studies. For example, I was reading Shupriya Chaudhury's essay on women life narratives a few days back. There also she was talking about how the women of future or present is actually trying to rebuild the stories of the women from past. So Dalit studies is also such a project. They are trying to narrate their own experience, but also the experience of the other. So there is a concatenation of experience, a collection of experience, which will give birth to, as I have already said, collective memory. And through writing, there is a connection which is being built among the Dalit subject, which also delineates the concept of the Dalit. And the last question by Shipradi, very briefly. Yes, violence is, I have worked on this in details in my doctoral work, and I have also mentioned Namora Manush. Violence as such, which is often thought of as a cessation of all politics, a cessation of the voices, it does not happen so. So the violence accumulates and it creates the ghost. Someone who is negated doesn't just disappear. So there has been recurrent discussions in all the papers on haunting. So the Namora Manush, the people who are killed, the story was not about the Dalit subjects only. It was the story about a tribal village where where not only the those tribals, but also all the ghosts of the tribals killed by the police comes back to haunt, to protest. They come together. As I have already said, this coming together of the ghosts the coming together of the lost subjectivity is definitely an important point in Dalit studies, in any study, in the study of any kind of marginality, Dalit studies, tribal studies, or even feminist gender studies, queer studies as well. I stop here.
May I?
Kollan had a question for Hardik.
Should I articulate that question first before responding to Shiprati and another question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe you respond first, right?
Yeah, I'll respond to the questions directed to me at first, and then I'll respond to Hardik's paper. Well, the first question was more about how Savarkar negotiated with the colonial powers, etc. I think there is enough substantial amount of research on that when it comes to Savarkar, although we should continue to work on that. I think Savarkar was certainly not the kind of anti-colonial person that the present political dispensation is trying to project, but he certainly had his moments of extremely dubious negotiations with the colonial powers that be at that time, not just in cellular jail, but also thereafter and even before that in some cases. So his anti-colonialism is certainly a debatable and questionable domain, and for that matter, I never implied in any sense that his project of anti-colonialism was without question. In fact, that was not the focus of my paper. My paper was simply trying to focus on how Savarkar, on one hand, talks about a certain level of anti-caste, and I think this part of my response to the question also responds to Shiprati's question. I think Savarkar does two things at the same time when it comes to caste and Hindutva project. A, he is certainly trying to put in place, at least in his writings, if not in real political activities or social reform activities, he's at least talking about certain anti-caste methods. He's all for, as I said, interdining, inter-caste marriages. He's trying to abolish untouchability. And as Subro's paper underscored, a very important fact that none of these thinkers on the side of the nationalist project, in many, many ways, despite their internal sort of differences, often shied away from completely abolishing caste. So caste as such is something that most of them believed in. And there are similar passages even in Savarkar's writings where he is not going to the last part of it, as if he is under some kind of pressure to not to push it to the last, to the highest extreme when it comes to abolishing caste. So I would not go to the extent of saying that Savarkar was this terribly radical anti-caste voice within the Hindutva ideologues. I will not say that. What is important for me is the second part of his writings, the second sort of feature characteristic that I discern in his writings, which is to constantly harp on this point that Hindutva is not a social project, it's not a religious idea, it is solely, predominantly, essentially a political, racialized even, because he calls it a Bharatiya Jati, and everybody is a Hindutva ideologue, Hindutva believer in Hindutva ideology. Everybody is a part and parcel of that sort of Hindu Rashtra. And as I said, even Muslims are invited to become the flag bearers of Hindutva there. They are not to be simply thrown out of the country through some policy making, through some legislature, etc. Activity, like the recent moves that we all protested against. But I think in his writings there is a concerted effort to constantly project Hindutva as something that is completely dissociated from the social and the religious. And that is a very interesting move, not simply in terms of how this can then later be translated into Modi's politics, the politics of the right wing in the Modi regime, wherein Dalits can be given certain important ministerial positions or even the president's position, and yet at the level of the social there isn't any activity on the part of the right wing to bring about sustained, committed project against caste, for abolishing caste, right? So many of us often talk about this dichotomy in a rueful way. Oh, the RSS, or even in a dismissive way for the left liberals. We are often dismissive about it, that, the RSS probably gives this tokenized representation to Dalits and OBCs, but ultimately it's a Brahminical organization. Well, the entire Indian society is Brahminical in that sense. So why blame or single out the BJP in that sense? Even the left has been accused of being extremely Brahminical, extremely casteist, and we are aware of that sort of rhetoric. So the point is not to simply call out a particular political dispensation as casteist or as Brahminical, but to also look at how the idea of the social and the political are forged in their ideologues. And that was the methodological perspective that I was trying to deploy. And when I did that, I realized that Savarkar's Hindutva writings on how he defines Hindutva, are extremely pushed into the domain of the political, as if the political is to be dissociated from the social. Now, that is the complex, objectionable, debatable, arguable position to assume. As I said, Hannah Arendt's essay on the Little Rock episode in 1950s during the desegregation procedures in the United States, and Srirupa probably knows even better than I do about those episodes in the US socio-political histories. We know that Hannah Arendt was trying to put forward an idea of the social that is defined by discrimination. So she says that the political is the realm of the equality. The governing principle of the realm of the political is equality. And in the social life, people are, doing all sorts of discrimination all the time. Now, in Hannah Arendt's proposition, there are other prerogatives, there are other concerns for which she has been criticized. And I'm not too sure, or I'm not immediately suggesting that Hannah Arendt's idea of the social and the political, as reflected in that controversial essay on the Little Rock episode, Reflections on the Little Rock is the name of that essay, if you want to take a quick look at it, are similar to those of Ambedkar's ideas on the social and the political, because that is not the case, I believe. But at least there is a similarity in terms of their anxieties when it comes to the mutual relationship or mutually sort of determining relationship between the social and the political, that the social can and does influence the political and vice versa. But that is not the idea that we come across in Savarkar. And it is through this differentiation of the political from the social that he tries to make the caste question as simply a prerogative of the social, and therefore invites people to be indifferent to the question of caste in the political domain. It becomes a question that does not mean anything for him in his political imagination, right? I certainly do not subscribe to it. That goes without saying. It would be laughable to assume that I subscribe to that view. It's simply a kind of reading that I'm trying to offer, right? So I think that sort of responds to both the questions. Now, Hardik, very quickly, I think your paper was simply very interesting. I have listened to an earlier presentation of probably this content in some other seminar or conference. I'm forgetting the exact occasion. But anyway, I have been thinking about this ever since I listened to it in that earlier occasion. When you are talking about these tribal women in your paper, you are also talking about critiquing the idea of the archive. You talk about Derrida, and you have done a fabulous job there. So congratulations to you for being very self-reflexive there. But I think there is another point of self-reflexivity that might be incorporated in your paper, and this is just a humble suggestion. If you look at the Dalit Panther Manifesto description of the term Dalit in 1972, the Dalit Panther Manifesto of 1972, I think the term Dalit has a very broad definition. But over the period of these last 3-4 decades, we have reduced the term Dalit to scheduled caste and something that is more determined in terms of caste, not in terms of so much the idea of the tribe, right? So I think in a sociological study or in a social science work like yours, or for that matter our papers, I think we need to be very careful about the allegations of politics of appropriation. So you are essentially deploying a perspective or a theoretical sort of insight that has been developed in Guru's writing, in Sarukai's writings, or their debates that they had in the EPW on Dalit women's question. But that question or the concerns that they raise in the context of the scheduled caste women, and to use the politically correct kind of term, Dalit there, might not be easily applicable to the predicament of the tribal women. I think I'm not suggesting that it can't be done. And you have done a wonderful job, as I said. But I think it has to be let there be a little note on it, that you are deploying a methodology that has been developed in Dalit studies in order to talk about tribal women who share certain predicaments, certain similarities in terms of their predicament, and yet might not be very similar to the predicament of the Dalit women or the scheduled caste women there, or other OBC women for that matter. So, the broader understanding of the term would have included tribal women as well. And in our common sense references, especially from the upper caste perspective, everybody is a Dalit. I have had many conversations with extremely informed sociologists, anthropologists, and social science scholars and humanities scholars who think OBCs are also Dalits, SCs are also Dalits, tribals are also Dalits. No, they are not. I think there is a great deal of sociological literature on the differences between these constituencies or governmental categories. And I think we need to take that into account when we are deploying a methodological insight that has been primarily derived or developed in the context of Dalit studies, Sarukai and Guru, and applying that sort of insight or that framework in order to look at the predicament of the tribal woman. That was the point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Hardik, would you respond, please? Yeah.
Thank you, Srirupa, for your very insightful comments on my paper. Yes, I am facing some kind of a difficulty and discomfort when you ask about what can we do beyond signification, and what kind of methodological tools can we really apply to kind of quote-unquote portray injury, suffering. At one level, it's almost impossible. And at another, and I have mentioned this in my paper, that we also have to keep a pragmatic approach open to addressing such issues. So at the least, we are working through two ways. The least, I'm not reducing all other possibilities, but for a kind of ease of speaking, I'm reducing it to that at the least of two. One way is to constantly kind of try to think methodology and methodological tools in an epistemic background, in an epistemic platform where you are kind of relieving yourself out of those methodological weight and burdens that you have to constantly practice. But I'm not a sociologist, so I'll not be able to speak about, especially about sociological tools. Another way, I think I tried to address it, but since I went on reading, it might have missed the point, and Subro has also raised the point. One way, when standard critical vocabularies will fail, that at least to me, to the kind of work and thinking I am trying to learn through my work, one way is to move through various notions of feminist thought in puncturing methodologies. And another almost impossible way is the question of a proper access to the other, which actually will stop me from, right now is stopping me from proceeding further to this. So these may be at the same time, as just I said, at least two ways that, of the many other ways, what's coming to my mind right now is that a chance that I'll just read a line from what I quoted Rose, that in that she had talked of a deconstructive move of holding on to both ends of the particular and the universal. So this is extremely difficult task, especially when it comes to various kinds of aestheticized representation of such subjects and identities. So this is really a difficulty. And another way, in a pragmatic way, I might go back to some basics, and I'm reminded of a very I don't know, by now it's dated, but I often go back to it. Sandra Harding's that famous essay, "Is there a feminist method?" So this is also a way to constantly, in one way, to puncture. And definitely in a pragmatic way, we will always fail to, if we approach through very cast in stone theories and methods. So we have already failed to do that. That was the question raised yesterday in the discussions by Professor Sarukai and Gopal Guru and Professor Guru, and in their works also, and many questions that in fact yesterday in one of the responses, Aniket Jaware's book was mentioned. We know that moving through these tools is not providing in some way the exact answers to the sustenance of such violence, of such experiences of injury, of suffering. So we are at maybe always at crossroads, and it's very difficult to take either of the side. I don't know, I'm a little confused myself in my own work also in responding to it. So my confusion probably is my answer here. And to Kolyan, thank you. Yes, I am a little bit aware of these differences. Maybe in a haste, I overlapped the categories that shouldn't have been overlapped, because yes, but this should be part of my a note should go in, definitely.
Yeah, your paper is otherwise remarkably self-reflexive. So I was just thinking if this can also be sort of added to that list. That's what I was. Yeah.
Also, my fears and anxieties when the organizers invited me to speak, that I have not attempted anything of this sort. So I'm aware of the differences and the history and the particular usage of the word and the various kinds of words that are being used, and it open the horizons. It is very important for us to remember. It's one of the major political tasks that we should carry on. Definitely, it was because I was also putting some journalist sources which were also overlapping the grounds. I should have cleared them out much before in my
yeah. Thank you.
We have time for more questions.
Srirupa, I don't think we have much time. So, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
How much time do we have? Not half an hour? No. We are already run out of time?
Yes.
Oh.
Actually, and it's almost 10. Almost,
It is
1
10.
minute
It
to
is
10.
10, yeah. In my wristwatch.
Yeah. So I think we have to end it here. And actually, I also had certain questions, because all four papers were extremely well written and insightful papers. And I had certain questions, and especially the kind of questions that you raised while you were commenting on the papers, in terms of the methodology of understanding what is unknown to us, and the very question that Subro raised at the end of his paper, the necessity of the training of imagination, which is actually a sort of an ethico-political necessity. which the sociologist should understand and should come to terms with such concerns. Maybe we'll talk about it tomorrow. So if we have time, but then I think that for today it will be too late. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought that little loud with the time, so I apologize.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't get you. What did you say?
Is it audible?
I'm kind of confused with the time. I'm sorry.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. Night is young. Still young. Yeah. Okay. So I think Srirupa, can we call it a day? Yeah.
Let's conclude the section.
Subro, you have something to say?
Yeah, I had one point to say. If you feel that it's too late, then I can mention that. But it is regarding some of the questions that were coming. I was just looking at the YouTube, and there was as if a kind of a huge fight was going on. And that is where I felt that one line maybe I can say specifically also the way you spoke about my emphasis on the training of the imagination. Like if Srirupa or Ritubi, if you feel that I can speak because it's already late, I understand.
What do you think, Ritu? I mean,
yes, we can always. You can always speak about 2 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing. I was just looking at, and then there is just a kind of huge debate going on there. That it's a kind of parallel session going on in the YouTube chat box, and where kind of a fight is going on between the use of theory. And it is interesting that people are saying that the concept of theory belongs only to elites, and this is a general view that we find very frequently even today also, that as if theory is elitist, it's jargon filled, it doesn't have any involvement with real changes. This kind of things I keep on saying, that as if it has nothing to do. In short, the debate between theory and practice, on which again, like the book I was referring, it has an important chapter, What's Left of Theory, and Spivak speaks on that, and also a recent book by Derrida also it talks about that same thing, theorizing practice, what we are doing. So in that context, I just wanted to say that this practicing caste is also a product of a training of an imagination that has happened for generations in such a way that I remember Ambedkar's view from that book, Untouchables Living in the Ghettos, when Ambedkar talks that even within the caste reformers, there are two types of reformers. And that is what again we find in the 19th century. The moderate reformers who say that untouchability and caste is not same. So we will encounter untouchability, but we will not encounter caste system. Caste system will be there, but untouchability is a different thing. It is a problem, and we have to get rid of that. So indirectly, again, that view that caste, as I was saying, giving away caste means giving away one's identity. And then there is the orthodox view, which says that untouchability and caste, they're all religious. So in both those kinds,
Subro, sorry to interrupt you. It actually goes deeper than that. There are people who would say that caste is bad, perhaps, but Varna was good, and Varna was loose. Varna eventually, I call it a degeneration model of caste. It degenerated into something terrible. It gave birth to caste and millions of castes, and then untouchability and so on. So it goes deeper than that. Yes.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say simply is that indirectly I say that I am not saying much anything new. This is already said by Gopal Guru, Sundar Sarukai, Jaware, and all, including as far as I remember, one of the earlier push in this realm comes from Devjani Ganguly, much earlier than Cracked Mirror was published. And Devjani Ganguly has pushed it towards hermeneutics and the importance of imagination and opening it to reinterpretation. The role of abstraction, the role of theory, the role of thinking. We have to think it in terms of theory. And this is not an abstraction that is nothing to do with the everyday life or experience. It is not absolutely detached from the material, but rather it is something where the practices are governed by a certain form of thinking which continues, and that is where we are seeing. So there is a similar thinking of theory also, which feels that as if, and there is this huge debate which in my one of the paper and also in the presidency talk I had referred that it continues to, there is a fight continuously going on, that there has to be, in order to speak of Dalits, I must only use Dalits. I must only refer to scholars who are, I should not use this Savarna versus Dalit. So, and this is what Ambedkar himself has quoted, that as if there is a sermon of hatred going on, as if one caste keeps, and this is an exact quote, that one caste loves to sing the sermon of hatred like the Germans used to sing for the English and the English used to sing for the Germans. So as if this kind of situation will go on forever. And this is what we are seeing also happening in YouTube. And this was interesting, that one is saying that, why are you using upper caste theorists in your paper on caste? Another is saying that, why don't, so, the point is not like that. The point is that if we continue to think like that, then we will continue to remain in our ghettos. And that is what actually we need to overcome. And that's where, like feminist epistemology, questions of race, questions of touch, questions of this kind of questions are approached so as to desituate, destabilize the very, a fixed category of caste. Yeah, that's just a general.
Could I just say one thing before we conclude this session? I don't know, the debate that is going on in YouTube, so, I should not be commenting on that debate per se, but I do think that there is, we need to have a discussion. We can talk about that tomorrow. We do need to talk about the kind of caution that we need ourselves to engage in. And to that end, to be attentive to the way in which we are reproducing certain ideas, concepts, and ways about, going about things. And to that end, I do think it is an important question, and I don't know exactly how the question was framed, so I'll take a look at it. That, what kind of archives do we use? What kind of theories and conceptual frameworks do we use? Who do we call to talk? Because, we must remember that we are talking about theorizing at a time when people who, have been, they have been speaking, but we have not been listening, but who are speaking in kind of louder voices. So we cannot forget that moment at which or during which we are talking about theorizing, certain ideas and experiences. So I do think there is a need to talk about, and feminist theory shows that, and we need to be careful about what kind of archives do we use, what kind of people do we call to speak. So maybe we can take this question up tomorrow when Professor Rao talks about her work, and to my mind, absolutely an important question.
I had
and just one thing that I just wanted to say here, that actually the whole point of theory in this webinar is that why do we invoke a theory here? This is a kind of conceptual, we consider as a conceptual understanding as something which invokes conceptual understanding, because when we are specifically in the discourse of sociology, when we are describing caste, when we consider caste as a mere empirical category, what we forget is that if we do not problematize the kind of concepts that we are dealing with, right, we won't be able to change the whole thing. So on the one hand, to do something, if caste is something to do, and if we have to do something about it, and so we also need to think about it, and this thought would be conceptual in nature, where we would also, problematize the concepts continuously. So I think and here lies the importance, significance of imagination. So I think we should end
Yeah.
here, Srirupa.
Rituji,
And
just
usually,
one line,
yeah.
like which I just wanted to add, that what I was continuously speaking and trying to push is not foreclosure. And I will just quote one line here from Eleanor Zeliot about Jyotiba Phule, and it's a very, very like fascinating point, which I hope will summarize that the first Dalit educationist is not a Dalit, but is a Dalit hero. So, this is something which is talking about the possibility of opening, that we are not foreclosing ourselves. And that is also something we need to be aware of, that just like the specificities of caste needs to be kept in mind, not reducing entirely into a generality, but also we have to keep open that, other modalities, other narratives, other views also can empower the tools of critique. Like exactly the same debate that Bugit also has written about Deleuze, Spivak's views on Deleuze, that Deleuze never wrote on colonialism, that's why should we use him? And that's a kind of a foreclosure. That because you have not worked on caste, because you have not worked on colonialism, that doesn't mean that you cannot offer any tool for rethinking, reconceptualizing. And that's why I was referring to Phule. And that's why Zeliot is also referring to that. Yeah.
Srirupa, please unmute yourself.
So we'll with that we'll conclude our discussion today, and let's hope that we can take some of these discussions forward tomorrow as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Srirupa.
And good night.
Thank you, Srirupadi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank all of, yeah, bye.
Right.